Mandy Boardman has always thought of herself as mature for her age. Even at 17 years old, she wasn't one to party or break the rules.
I was pretty responsible. I didn't really have time to be wild. I had a job, I had school, I played softball. I grew up a block away from the ball fields, and it was the place to be.
So in the spring of 1996, Mandy was excited to join a co-ed adult softball league within her close-knit Indianapolis community.
At 17, you become an adult when it comes to softball, so you have to join an adult league, and I decided that I would sub for a team, so I would get my fix.
Through the team, Mandy met all kinds of people, including 35-year-old David Wise.
Hi, my name's David. What's your name?
David worked at a shipping company, was a fine ball player, and seemed keen on offering Mandy extra support.
He was much older than me, but he was very nice to me and very polite. He would let me know how he appreciated me being there subbing for the team.
Good catch.
So when David made his true intentions known shortly after Mandy turned 18 by asking her out on a date, Mandy wasn't the least bit put off by their sizable age difference.
He just took me to a local Italian restaurant, and it was very quiet, nice. There was definitely an attraction there, and he always knew how to make me feel pretty and wanted.
Mandy and Dave were kind of an odd pairing, and it might have been because of the age difference. So to me, they were a little odd, but they seemed happy.
Unfortunately, not everyone was as thrilled as Mandy about her new boyfriend.
I was not a happy mommy, not happy at all. And I told her, I said, he's way too old for you. He could be your father. And she said, but he's not, you know, and I was like, well, he could be, so that makes him too old for you.
I always felt my mother was overprotective. It was very normal of her to be concerned about who I was dating, which probably made me want to date him even more.
Mandy knew her feelings for David were different, but she became concerned when she noticed the amount of alcohol he seemed to consume regularly.
I was not a drinker. I did not do that. So being around somebody who was always doing it was just very uncomfortable. So I did tell him, I'm okay if you drink a couple beers every now and then, but the hard stuff had to stop.
You've been drinking way too much.
And to her pleasant surprise, David completely listened to her request.
He stopped drinking. You know, he actually even stopped drinking beer. I felt if he's going to quit drinking for me, this is going to be great because he obviously wants to make me happy.
Within a year, it became obvious that marriage was in Mandy's near future.
David and I had spoken about marriage a couple times, and I said to myself, if I was going to get married, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be married forever.
That spring, Mandy wed David in a simple ceremony in front of family and friends, much to Mandy's mother's dismay.
It broke my heart because of the fact that I disliked him. I was really no part of it at all, none. And so I sat in the very last row, and I wore completely black.
It was not very encouraging, but I was in love with him, and we were going to get married, and not hell or high water was going to stop me.
But hell is exactly where Mandy would find herself. And when she slowly uncovered the layers of David's deceptions, it would become clear Mother does know best.
I almost lost my breath.
This is some pretty weird, sick stuff that's going on.
I was just so dumbfounded and shocked. I never thought something like this would happen to me.
In the spring of 1998, Mandy Wise was determined to prove to everyone that her marriage to new husband David was a success.
That's what you do. You get married and you're married forever.
Mandy's not a quitter. She will try to her last breath to keep right on going, and she wanted everything to work out.
And indeed, it seemed it would. When nearly 9 months to her wedding day, Mandy delivered a healthy baby boy. And 1 year later, she became pregnant again, this time with a daughter. But by the time their little girl was born in December 2001, Mandy noticed that David seemed to be falling back into an old habit.
The drinking had gotten to a point where it became more often. People around us started noticing and making comments.
He was more boisterous, more obnoxious. If he was awake, he pretty much had a beer in his hand.
Fine. Fantastic.
Mandy had no clue why David had suddenly gone back on his word to stop drinking and decided to confront him one evening.
What is wrong with you?
I tried to explain to David that not only was I not wanting to accept his drinking, but I didn't want an alcoholic around my children. I'm yelling at him. He's yelling back at me, and he smacked me. I was just so shocked. It was definitely a tipping point. He never apologized. And so from that point on, it seemed like arguments weren't just arguments. They were wars.
Soon, Mandy and David were arguing over everything.
David and I didn't have a very great, intimate relationship because I didn't want to do it.
You're so drunk and I don't want to sleep with you.
The attraction was gone, and he would just push and push and push, and so I would finally just be intimate so that we could get the argument over with and move on.
Mandy refused to admit defeat, so over the next few years, she did her best to ignore the husband-shaped elephant in the room. She started her own cleaning company and focused on her kids instead.
I think she wanted everybody to feel like she was in a good marriage. Most of us could see that it was a little rocky.
By 2005, with all Mandy had going on, she wasn't too alarmed when she began feeling incredibly groggy, even after getting a solid night's sleep.
I was finding myself in the middle of the day not being able to keep my eyes open. I couldn't figure out exactly what was going on with me.
There was many, many times that I called there at their house, and he would answer the phone. Well, she's asleep. I said, it's 4:30 in the afternoon. Why is she sleeping?
She's tired. She's been working hard.
But when Mandy began to wake up in the middle of the night with a strange taste in her mouth, she couldn't help but take notice.
It was very bitter, very strong taste that was like stuck there and wouldn't go away.
Mandy's mind landed on the only possible explanation she could muster.
We had a canopy over our bed, and I thought, well, maybe there are spiders up in there, and they're coming down, and they're jumping in my mouth.
It's gross.
I thought, this is crazy, but what else could it be? David never seemed very concerned. It was like, oh, well, you must be eating spiders.
Go back to sleep.
As the months went by, Mandy continued to feel exhausted. By Thanksgiving 2006, she was notably tired, but looking forward to the holiday.
My father was coming. I was very excited to be cooking for my whole family.
Mandy went to sleep that night feeling happy for the first time in a long time, until she suddenly awoke to a blinding sensation.
I was woken up to a light in my face. But I look, and then I see the light go away, and I watch my husband run away.
What are you doing?
I saw him on the other side of the bed stuffing some stuff underneath the mattress. I'm like, what's going on here?
What is that showing? What did you do?
In the fall of 2006, Mandy Wise woke up in a panic when she caught her husband suspiciously hiding something under the mattress.
And I'm like, what's going on here? What are you doing?
Mandy ran over to the other side of the bed and discovered what David had been concealing.
I found this vial and this dropper.
What is this?
The vial has a chalky-looking liquid in it. He pretty much just sat there in silence, like I was some kind of crazy person waking up in a rage.
You are overreacting.
Well, at this time, I had the taste in my mouth, the taste that I had before, so I asked, did you do this?
Have you been putting this in my mouth?
And he's avoiding everything that I'm asking him.
Man, you were acting crazy.
After hours of not getting anywhere with David, Mandy decided she needed space.
So I went across the street to Nicole's house to tell her what had happened.
She was crying. She didn't know what to do. I told her I didn't feel that that was right. I would be furious with my husband if he did that to me, because it was very evident he was drugging her. He was giving her something.
A few hours later, Mandy returned home, ready to face David.
I asked him what was in that vial, and he told me that he had crushed up some Xanax to help me sleep. I said, I don't understand why you're trying to help me sleep when I am already sleeping.
You've been giving me sleeping pills. I have been sleeping fine.
And he told me that this is what I needed.
That's why she'd been so tired and lethargic and sleeping so much. And, you know, above and beyond the fact that he did what he did, what if he gave her too much? I just couldn't believe he was doing that to her.
So Mandy made David promise to never take her health into his own hands again.
I just asked him to please kindly stop. He was like, okay, I'll stop.
I won't do it again.
You promised me.
After 8 years of marriage, Mandy wasn't sure what to think.
There were so many things that were going through my head, but I wanted to believe him. I wanted to make my marriage work, so I had to believe him.
So in the winter of 2007, when Mandy awoke to a familiar light shining in her face, she was completely distraught.
I had already been through this, and I felt like I knew what was going on, so I jump up immediately. Well, David takes off.
Come back here.
Shocked by his audacity, Mandy chased David out to the garage.
Where is it?
I said, show me what's underneath the cushion. And he pulls out the vial and the dropper. I was so angry.
Mandy knew David had been drugging her yet again. The question was, why? As the young mother of 2 children, Mandy wasn't sure what to do next. For the next 3 months, she and David barely spoke as she tried to work out a plan in her head.
I didn't want my kids to know what happened. I had to figure out what was going on here.
But in the fall of 2008, the reason behind all the troubling events became clear.
I was home from work, and David had left his cell phone at home. So I decided I'm going to go ahead and investigate. So I start looking through his phone, and I'm looking through texts and phone calls.
And the second Mandy opened his videos file, her heart stopped.
What I saw in the videos was nothing that I had ever expected to see in my entire life. It was horrible.
Oh my God.
Mandy didn't have much choice but to show the world what he really was.
In the fall of 2008, after discovering that her husband David had been drugging her in her sleep, Mandy Wise decided to have a look at the videos on his cell phone.
I found 3 videos. I
Oh my gosh.
saw David having sexual relations with me while I was sleeping. I looked like a corpse. It was horrible. It was almost like necrophilia. I thought, how in the world did this happen? I don't remember this.
Then it hit her. This was the reason he was drugging her.
I felt very angry. This whole time, he was lying to me, telling me that I need what he's giving me. Now I finally had proof that something seriously messed up was happening to me. I tried to send them to my email, and I couldn't figure it out on the phone. So I recorded the videos on the phone with the camcorder. That way I knew I had them.
When David arrived home, Mandy was quick to confront him.
His reaction was almost like no reaction. Like he wasn't surprised that they were there.
Mandy no longer doubted what she needed to do next. After 11 years of marriage, she filed for divorce and David moved out.
It was very hard to take that step to let everybody know that I failed and that my marriage didn't work and break apart my family. That's probably the hardest thing I've ever done. My kids. They were just devastated.
I thought he was sick and twisted, and I asked her, are you going to take this to the police? And she said, I don't think I can. I don't want anybody to know this. He's gone. It's done. This is not going to happen to me anymore.
By October 2009, Mandy and David's divorce was final. It was difficult for Mandy to acknowledge how wrong she'd been about David.
I feel like there's somewhere where David went off the grid, and people like that are capable of doing anything. And I thought if he could do this to his wife, then he could probably do it to anybody. So I decided to make the phone call to the Indianapolis Police Department.
David Wise was arrested in August 2011 and charged with 1 count of rape and 5 counts of deviant sexual behavior. Without physical evidence, however, he could not be charged with drugging Mandy. David pled not guilty, and on April 28, 2014, after 3 years of legal battles, he went to trial. Along with the video evidence, one of David's own friends testified against him.
David called the wife of one of his friends and made some statements that something was happening to Mandy while she was asleep.
The witness told the jury David said to her that he had no sex life with his wife and admitted to drugging her to have his way.
If she's not going to get it, I'm going to take it.
He explained to her that he would do it so that later he could watch the videos and enjoy them during his own time. It was just unfathomable.
Even David himself testified that he had given his wife drugs for 3 years.
He had been prescribed Xanax and Ambien on a number of different occasions. David said he was experiencing lapses in judgment due to drinking.
It was more than enough evidence, and 2 days later, David Wise was convicted on all charges. But much to Mandy's surprise, the judge imposed a light sentence: 20 years with 12 years suspended and 8 years in home detention with a GPS monitor.
I was devastated. This man was able to go home and lead his life. I was terrified.
You could have knocked me over with a feather. I was like, how can they do that?
The sentence he got was for people with limited or no criminal history. Did I agree with it? I didn't. Spousal rape is a very serious crime, and anytime an adult commits a crime like this, they need to be held accountable.
But 2 months after the sentencing, David failed to charge his GPS monitor for 6 hours.
They found him at home, and he claimed that his battery had just died.
The court found he had violated his home detention rules and revised his sentence to 5 years in prison and 3 years home detention.
I almost couldn't control myself because I just was so grateful for the peace. I felt like it was finally over.
Today, Mandy knows coming forward exposed the ugly truth in her marriage that she fought so hard to hide.
I feel like what I have done has brought attention to spousal rape. And now people are becoming more aware. Everybody needs to know that if you don't give consent, there is no consent.
With everything that she's had to do, I'm very proud of her for coming forward and saying, this is me. It happened to me. I'm very proud of her for that. It takes a lot of courage.
I never thought something like this would happen to me. But I'm definitely still strong-headed. And I want to make sure that whatever I do makes a difference.
In the summer of 1998, high school graduate Tabitha Howe was excited to strike out on her own, moving to a house with a great group of friends.
I worked right across the street at the restaurant, and we did what teenagers do. We all hung out, played video games, watched movies. We just had a good time.
But Tabitha's newest roommate, Scott Wellington, didn't seem to fit in.
Scott was working at a grocery store as a bagger, and at first I didn't like him. He was only 17, just a young kid who was arrogant.
Before long, Tabitha was pleased to see that Scott had a charming side.
He seemed like he was caring. He would notice, like, if I did my nails, which most men wouldn't notice. He picked up the house while we were at work. He seemed like a decent person. We just became very close.
Tabitha made it known she was interested in Scott, and they transitioned effortlessly from just friends into a couple.
I felt like maybe this could be something bigger. Maybe we could progress in our relationship and start building a life together. He was my first real love.
They got along well. They would also laugh at each other and tease each other. They were tickled to be together.
Over the next 2 years, Tabitha and Scott found a place of their own and spent every moment together.
We weren't rushing things. I felt I knew who he was. Everything was going pretty good.
But something was about to change all of that.
I found out I was pregnant. I was scared. I was really scared. I knew what it took to take care of a baby.
Tabitha wasn't sure how to tell Scott.
All right, sweetheart, I gotta go to work.
Okay, hon.
All right. What's wrong?
I'm pregnant.
And he just stopped
What?
and just kind of froze, which made me panic a little.
Okay, you're pregnant. Let's do this thing.
But then he was like really excited about it. He genuinely seemed very happy. And he said he always wanted a family. And I think that Scott thought it was definitely going to be cake and just really fun, and I knew it wasn't like that at all.
9 months later, the young couple welcomed a baby boy.
Scott was a good dad. He was a really good dad. Tabitha was a very good mother. And she was happy, I was happy.
I never wanted kids. But once you hold your baby for the first time, there's nothing else that can take that place.
And by November of 2002, Tabitha had more surprising news for Scott.
I said, "You're going to be a daddy again." And he was absolutely thrilled. We already had one perfect little boy, and now we're going to have another baby.
To financially prepare, Tabitha found a job in the accounting department of a local store.
I was working nights, and Scott was working days. He went on to become a machinist, and he was making decent money. It was enough that we could get by.
But the excitement of another baby was soon eclipsed by a troubling new side of Scott.
Our son was learning to walk, and we had a small shelf up against the wall, and he grabbed onto it to steady himself, and it ended up falling on top of him. He was absolutely fine, but Scott got very angry.
Put this here.
I just thought he was being protective, but I'd never seen him really get angry before.
Then in March of 2003, life took a turn for the worse when Scott announced he'd been laid off from his job. For the next few months, Scott bounced from job to job, but nothing seemed to stick.
I would pick up any available shifts at work, but he did not do anything. He didn't do the dishes, he didn't pick up the house. He was very reluctant to actually get a job and just make some money to help out.
She was very frustrated by, always having to clean up whatever mess that was there.
Finally, in July 2003, in time for the arrival of their second son, Scott found another good job as a machinist in Greenville, just across the New Hampshire state line.
He seemed really happy. He seemed to get a little bit of that spark back and talking like things are going to get better.
But Tabitha would soon learn that with every new high came an unbearable low.
It was a roller coaster ride. I was really scared.
And gradually, Tabitha would be swept into a whirlwind of deception so shocking she wondered if she would even survive.
I was stunned. I couldn't quite wrap my head around what had happened.
You see this stuff in books and TV shows, you don't think it's going to happen to you.
In July 2003, after giving birth to their second son, Tabitha Howe was relieved when her boyfriend Scott Wellington landed a promising new job as a machinist in the quaint town of Greenville.
Greenville, it seemed nice and quiet. It's a small little town. We found a cute little 2-bedroom apartment. It was so close to the post office. We were told we had to get a post office box because the mail delivery service would not deliver our mail. Scott always had the keys with him, and he would always get the mail.
With an additional mouth to feed, the couple began pulling long hours at work to support their growing family. And the stress of rarely seeing each other began to take its toll.
We were kind of like ships passing in the night. It put up a lot of barriers in between us. During Christmas, I would work until midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and he would accuse me of being out cheating on him.
Where have you been?
I was at work.
It got to the point where I would have to print out the times that I punched in at work and punched out. I felt like Scott wanted to have complete control over me.
Tabitha was sad, you know, and she just didn't know how to prove to him that she wasn't with other men.
Don't walk away from me.
Tabitha didn't know what to make of this new side to Scott. But even more surprising, one day that December, Scott completely blindsided her.
Scott talked about getting married. It was not something that I have ever wanted. It's just a piece of paper to me. But that's what he wanted. He wanted a real family. So he went and got a ring.
Will you marry me?
Wow.
We had 2 kids. Obviously, this was something that was long-term.
Yeah.
But we never set a date. We just stayed engaged, and I think it was really more in his mind than anything.
And after giving birth to a daughter in 2005, and then another little girl in 2009, it seemed their family was complete.
I knew I didn't want any more kids. 4 was more than enough. Scott was fine with that. It seemed like things were getting a lot better.
Then Scott arrived home one day early from work and dropped a bombshell.
Why are you home from work so early?
I quit.
I was just dumbfounded. I said, "What do you mean you quit? How are we going to support the kids?"
You know we need the health insurance.
I know that. Just get off my back about it.
It turned into a big fight, and he yelled and he screamed.
As Tabitha took on more hours at work, she struggled to understand why, out of the blue, Scott tossed his family into yet another financial storm. It wasn't until January of 2010 when Tabitha showed Scott a listing for a machinist job at a local company called C&M that he finally took action.
It seemed like a really great company. He called them. He went down for an interview. They ended up hiring him.
Tabitha hoped their troubles were finally behind them. But they were just getting started when Scott made a horrifying decision that would not only devastate Tabitha, but would betray his entire company.
He just sounded like he wanted to destroy her.
I was terrified. He was a completely different person.
In 2010, Tabitha Howe was thrilled when her fiancé, Scott Wellington, landed a solid job, one that enabled him to support their 4 young children, ages 1 through 9. But despite Scott making good money, he seemed to grow more irritable by the day.
We can't afford more than 1 line.
And before long, his controlling streak returned with a vengeance.
Scott, I really need a phone.
Scott got the home phone shut off, and that's when he really started to isolate me from everybody.
I got her another cell phone, and I paid the bill. He was not happy about that because there was nothing he could do.
And though Scott wanted more control, He didn't seem to want to spend more time with Tabitha and the kids.
He would get up really early and say he was going to work, like 3 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, thank you.
One time, I brought him to work, and I said, we'll have lunch with you. We'll have a little picnic outside. Oh, no, you can't bring the kids there.
No.
There could be metal scraps in the yard.
It's gonna be dangerous for the kids.
He made it sound like it was concern for the kids.
Then, in December 2010, just in time for the holidays, the pendulum swung again.
I have a little bit of a surprise for you.
He came home and he just started pulling money out of his pockets. And he said that he got a $3,000 bonus from work. I said, really? He said, I helped them get a really big contract. It was fabulous. So I was like, well, it's going to be a really good Christmas for the kids.
But when Christmas Eve finally rolled around, Scott had plans of his own.
Hey, sweetheart, I think I'm gonna take off and hang out with the guys for a little bit.
Okay, that's fine.
I said, just don't be too late because, we have a lot to do. He was like, okay, He gave me a kiss. He left.
Boom! Gotcha.
Tabitha and I were online playing a game. It was just sort of a way to pass the time.
When Scott returned home later that night, it was clear something other than the holiday spirit had possessed him.
I was sitting on the computer. I was chatting with Emmy. And Scott stormed back into the house, just in a rage, just angry, yelling.
I know what you've been doing.
He started to accuse me of cheating again.
You want her? You know what I'm
And then he picked me up and threw me across the living room.
You could hear the physical tussle. You knew a physical altercation was going on. The microphone just sort of hit the desk with a thump. And then it just went silent. So I sat there, sort of stunned, and immediately started trying to call her.
I was scared. I was really scared. Now all the kids are out of bed. I said, I'm calling the police. He took off. I was terrified, and I called my mom.
She called me, crying, and said that he just went off the deep end, and he had just left on foot. She asked me to come up there, and I did.
She finally texted me. She was okay, that her mom was on the way, and that he had left.
Tabitha struggled to understand what had prompted the attack. But when Scott returned later that night, apparently calmed down, Tabitha let him stay.
He seemed legitimately sorry for what had happened.
I'm so sorry.
I didn't really want him back in the house, but it was Christmas Eve. I couldn't let him ruin Christmas for the kids. It's supposed to be a magical time, not the day your father leaves.
But soon what happened that Christmas would be the least of Tabitha's worries, when her life took another dramatic turn, one that would end with a chilling discovery.
He's devious, crooked, he's a sociopath.
There's a very small percentage of people that are just absolutely evil. It shocked me.
I was terrified, and I thought, was this his plan all along?
On Christmas Eve 2010, Tabitha Howe was suddenly attacked by her partner of 12 years, Scott Wellington. But she allowed him to come back home, if only for the sake of their 4 young children.
Scott was very quiet when he came back. He seemed legitimately sorry for what had happened, but he never offered an explanation. I made the decision that night that things were completely over between the two of us, and I just needed to figure out what the next step was.
No, do not touch me.
And 3 months later, in March 2011, Tabitha couldn't take it any longer.
It's over.
We had a really big fight. Everything just came out. I just couldn't handle it anymore. I was all done. I just needed him gone. I threw him out.
Over the next month, Tabitha wanted nothing to do with Scott, but with the children, it wasn't possible.
Scott was supposed to come and see the kids for Easter, and we had agreed upon that.
As Tabitha prepared for the visit, she kept busy by running a few errands.
I was going to the grocery store, and I stopped to get the mail.
Getting the mail had always been Scott's job. So when Tabitha opened their P.O. box, she was floored at the number of unpaid bills. But it was what she found in another envelope that tore her world apart.
There was a card in there, and I figured it's from my grandparents to the kids. I didn't think anything of it, so I opened it up, and it's a sympathy card with some money orders in it. And I start reading it. Dear Scott, we're so sorry for the loss of your wife. You and your kids are in our prayers. I'm like, who is this for? You know, they must have made a mistake. Somebody sent this to the wrong address. I have no idea what's going on. But then I kind of started to wonder, was Scott planning on killing me? Was this his plan all along? I was terrified. Why would he tell people I was dead? I called Scott. I said, don't come and see the kids. Don't come to my house. Don't come anywhere near me.
The following Monday morning, Tabitha spoke with Scott's boss, who was surprised to see her alive and well. As they discussed the circumstances surrounding the card, Tabitha learned the situation was far worse than she imagined. Not only had Scott told his colleagues she'd passed away, he had done so after weaving a year-long tragic tale about a mythical battle with cancer.
Scott told them that I had been diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer and that I was getting sicker and sicker by the day. He then told them that I had to have a double mastectomy and that it wasn't looking good.
In turn, his company had given Scott almost $7,000 in donations to help offset the mounting medical costs, plus several weeks of paid time off. Right around the time Tabitha kicked him out, Scott told his company that she had died.
Certain things started to make sense. He didn't want me to go out. He didn't want me to be seen by people. He didn't want me to bring the kids to work for lunch because I was supposedly sick at home, withering away and dying. He wanted to have complete control over me and isolate me.
That day, Tabitha got a restraining order against Scott, while Scott's boss contacted police and pressed charges.
The owner of the company explained to me he had to report a theft, and the story of the theft was bizarre, to say the least. I had Scott come in for an interview, and he didn't try to lie or deny anything that had happened. He painted the picture that the family was hard on times, and he was trying to make ends meet as best he could. That was his motivation.
Never supposed to get to this level.
Scott was charged with 2 counts of theft by deception, one for the amount of $5,000 and $2,000 for previous donations.
I knew about the $3,000 that he had gotten at Christmas, but the other money I knew nothing about. I don't know exactly what he was doing with it.
On May 16, 2011, Scott accepted a deal and pled guilty to 1 count of theft by deception, claiming he needed the money to support his family.
I don't believe anything that comes out of his mouth. He says he did it to support his family. But we didn't see that money.
Scott only spent a few days in jail and was placed on administrative probation.
I realize he didn't kill anybody, but he took advantage of people. I think he should have gone away for a while. I do.
It's absolutely ridiculous. These people were trying to help somebody out who they thought was having a difficult time, and he didn't care. That's sick. Absolutely just sick.
Today, Tabitha still struggles to understand how and why her teenage love turned into such a master manipulator.
Scott was very smart in the way that if he lied to you, he could remember that. And he would continue with that lie for as long as it took. And thinking about not getting married, that was definitely when I knew I made the right choice.
As time passed, Tabitha tried to move beyond all the hurt and devastation Scott caused. She focuses on being a survivor.
Tabitha is fantastic. She's doing very well with the kids. The kids are all good. Every day she gets better and better.
He tried to destroy me, but I'm back to who I originally was, and I believe I'm stronger for it. I have a full-time job. I take care of my kids. I can do this on my own.
History has a peculiar way of choosing which nightmares it remembers and which it allows to fade into the obscurity of forgotten archives. When we think of the late 19th century and the birth of the modern serial killer, our collective consciousness almost instinctively drifts across the Atlantic Ocean. We picture the dense, suffocating fog of London in the year 1888. We envision the dim, flickering glow of gaslights illuminating the cobblestone streets of Whitechapel, and we whisper the name that has become synonymous with unidentified terror: Jack the Ripper. The Whitechapel murders have been analyzed, fictionalized, and immortalized in countless books, films, and historical debates. Yet, the chilling truth is that a full 3 years before the Autumn of Terror gripped the heart of the British Empire, a vastly different but equally savage phantom was already stalking the nights in the American South. This is a story of a predator who operated without a blueprint, in an era before the term serial killer even existed in the lexicon of law enforcement or the public imagination. This is the story of the first true serial killer in the history of the United States. It is one of the darkest, most profoundly unsettling, and utterly baffling chapters in the annals of American criminology. The setting was not the crowded slums of a European metropolis, but the rapidly developing city of Austin, Texas, during the years 1884 and 1885. Today, Austin is known as a vibrant center of culture and technology, but in the 1880s, it was a city caught in a fascinating and turbulent transition. It was a place where the untamed, rugged edges of the Texas frontier were rapidly giving way to the sophisticated aspirations of a booming, modernizing society. The population was swelling, wealth was accumulating, and grand mansions were rising along the dusty avenues, standing as monuments to the city's sudden prosperity. The atmosphere was thick with the promise of progress and the relentless march of industry. However, beneath this veneer of rapid development and newfound wealth, a terrifying shadow was preparing to envelop the city, effectively bringing its optimistic momentum to a paralyzing halt. To understand the profound terror that gripped Austin, one must first understand the specific targets of this unidentified monster and the distinct social geography of the city at that time. The victims of the initial wave of these atrocities were not the wealthy elites who occupied the grand mansions. Instead, the killer deliberately targeted a highly vulnerable, marginalized demographic: Black women who worked as domestic servants, cooks, and maids. These women were the invisible backbone of Austin's affluent households. They spent their days maintaining the pristine illusion of upper-class life, laboring in the kitchens and drawing rooms of the wealthy. When the sun set, however, they retreated to a very different world. They resided in what were known as servant quarters, small, modest, and often poorly secured structures located in the backyards or alleys directly behind the imposing estates of their employers. These servant quarters were geographically close to the centers of wealth and power, yet they existed in a completely separate reality regarding safety and security. The structures were simple, often lacking robust locks or sturdy windows. In the scorching heat of the Texas night, doors and windows were frequently left unlatched or wide open in a desperate bid to catch a cooling breeze. This architectural and social vulnerability provided the perfect hunting ground for a predator who thrived in the darkness. The women sleeping within these quarters were exhausted from long hours of intense physical labor, sinking into deep slumbers from which they would be violently and irrevocably awakened. The modus operandi of the killer was a masterclass in psychological terror and unrestrained savagery, executed with a chillingly consistent routine that spoke to a deeply ingrained pathology. The predator was entirely a creature of the night. He never struck in the daylight, nor did he attack his victims on the open streets. His domain was the most intimate and sacred space a person possesses: the bedroom. The attacks invariably occurred in the dead of night or the hazy, disorienting hours of the early dawn. The killer moved with the stealth of a phantom, navigating the shadows of the back alleys and private gardens without ever raising an alarm. There was no need for forced entry, no shattered glass or splintered wood to betray his arrival. He exploited the very nature of his victims' living conditions, slipping silently through the unlocked doors or open windows of the servant quarters. He would stand over the beds of these deeply slumbering women, watching them in their most defenseless state. The transition from peaceful sleep to unimaginable horror was instantaneous. The killer did not simply attack his victims where they lay. A crucial part of his twisted ritual involved physical displacement. He would brutally drag the disoriented and terrified women from the presumed safety of their beds, forcing them out of their homes and into the dark, exposed yards or secluded areas nearby. This act of dragging them into the open air was not just a means of isolating them. It was a profound violation, a stripping away of any remaining sense of sanctuary before the ultimate violence commenced. Once in the yard, under the cover of the Texas night, the true depths of the killer's depravity were unleashed. The violence was not calculated in the sense of using sophisticated or specialized weaponry. Instead, it was raw, chaotic, and terrifyingly opportunistic. The killer utilized crude, heavy instruments, weapons of brutal efficiency that were often sourced directly from the victims' own homes or yards. Axes meant for chopping firewood, heavy iron bars, and large kitchen knives became the tools of his macabre trade. The sheer force and malice behind the attacks were unprecedented. The victims were subjected to savage beatings, with the blunt force trauma primarily concentrated on their heads, rendering them unrecognizable and silencing any chance of calling out for help. But the physical bludgeoning was only one facet of the nightmare. The killer also perpetrated horrific sexual assaults, violating the women before, during, or after the fatal blows were struck. Furthermore, the bodies were subjected to unimaginable mutilation, torn and pierced by sharp objects in a frenzy of rage and sadistic gratification that defied all logical comprehension. The scenes left behind for the morning light to reveal were tableaus of absolute carnage, shocking even the most hardened law enforcement officers and plunging the entire city into a state of hysterical fear. The psychological toll on the city of Austin cannot be overstated. This was not a single, isolated tragedy. It was a sustained campaign of terror that stretched out over the course of a long, agonizing year. As the body count rose, the initial whispers of a madman turned into a deafening roar of communal panic. Citizens who had once felt secure behind the walls of their rapidly growing city now viewed every shadow with paralyzing suspicion. The night, once a time of rest and reprieve from the sweltering Texas sun, transformed into a suffocating blanket of dread. People barricaded their doors, armed themselves, and lay awake, listening to the agonizing silence of the dark, wondering if the phantom was standing just outside their window. The sheer brutality of the crimes, coupled with the absolute lack of any discernible motive beyond pure, unadulterated malice, created an atmosphere of apocalyptic anxiety. It felt as though a supernatural entity, a demon cloaked in human flesh, had descended upon Austin to exact an indiscriminate toll of blood. The authorities were completely ill-equipped to handle a predator of this magnitude. They were facing a modern monster with antiquated tools. The sheer frustration and helplessness of the police force only amplified the public's terror. No one was safe, and no one knew where or when the shadow would strike next. The killer moved seamlessly between the racial and social divides of the city, an unseen force that mocked the very concept of law and order. It was during this period of unprecedented hysteria that the true scope of the horror demanded a name, a title that could encapsulate the sheer scale of the devastation. Among the residents of Austin during this terrifying period was a man who would later become one of America's most celebrated literary figures, the renowned short story writer William Sidney Porter, universally known by his pen name, O. Henry. In 1885, while observing the paralyzing fear that held his city hostage, Porter wrote a letter to a friend, attempting to articulate the madness unfolding around him. In that correspondence, he coined a phrase that perfectly captured the ruthless, systematic nature of the slaughter. He referred to the unidentified fiend not just as a murderer, but as the servant girl annihilator. It was a moniker that sent shivers down the spine, acknowledging that this was not merely a series of homicides, but a targeted annihilation of a specific, vulnerable class of women. The name stuck, etching itself into the historical record. The servant girl annihilator became a symbol of ultimate, unstoppable evil. The fact that this individual operated with such absolute impunity, leaving a trail of shattered bodies and broken communities in his wake before vanishing into the mists of history, makes this case a profound and unsettling anomaly. The sheer brutality of the modus operandi, the deliberate targeting of marginalized women in their most vulnerable moments, and the profound, suffocating fear that gripped a rapidly expanding American city create a narrative that is as compelling as it is horrifying. As we prepare to delve deeper into the specific timeline of the slaughter and the tragic, individual stories of the women who lost their lives to this phantom of the Texas night, we must brace ourselves to confront a darkness that has remained unsolved and unpunished for over a century. The year 1884 was drawing to a close, and the city of Austin was about to be introduced to a nightmare from which it would never truly awake. The city of Austin at the end of the 19th century presented a fascinating and cruel dichotomy, a complex backdrop that would become the stage for one of the most horrific murder sprees in American history. To truly grasp the nature of these crimes and understand how a predator could operate with such impunity, it is absolutely essential to delve into the social and geographical atmosphere of the time. We are not talking about a sprawling, anonymous metropolis, but a city in full bloom, a city where the dividing line between wilderness and modern civilization was still blurred and often brutal. The streets, though expanding rapidly, turned into quagmires at the slightest rain, and street lighting, before the introduction of the now famous light towers, was woefully inadequate, leaving vast swathes of the city plunged into thick, impenetrable darkness as soon as night fell. It was precisely in this darkness, both literal and metaphorical, that the killer found a sanctuary and hunting ground. Austin's growing prosperity was manifested in the construction of vast and opulent mansions, status symbols erected by a white ruling class profiting from a booming economy. But this facade of pristine wealth rested entirely on the shoulders of an invisible, silent, and fundamentally marginalized workforce. The true victims of this nightmare, those who would pay the bloodiest price for the city's indifference, did not belong to the elite dancing in candlelit salons. The killer, with chilling precision that betrayed a profound understanding of society's flaws, first focused his bloodlust on an extremely vulnerable demographic. His preferred targets were almost exclusively Black women. These women worked tirelessly as domestic servants, cooks, laundresses, or maids for the city's wealthy families. Less than 2 decades after the end of the Civil War and the formal abolition of slavery, the daily reality of these workers remained rooted in absolute economic servitude and spatial segregation. They formed the invisible backbone of Texas society, toiling away at grueling manual labor from sunrise to sunset for meager wages and without any form of social or legal protection. Their days were a long procession of physical labor, spent cleaning floors, carrying heavy loads of water, preparing complex meals in the sweltering heat of southern kitchens, and maintaining the comfort of employers who often viewed them as mere amenities. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, offering a brief respite from the oppressive Texas heat, these women did not return to the safety of their homes. They retreated to what were called the servants' quarters. These dwellings were modest structures, often dilapidated, hastily built from cheap wood. They were relegated to the very back of stately estates, hidden behind the grand mansions, accessible only by muddy service lanes or unpaved paths. This geographical isolation within the bourgeois estates themselves created a fatal dynamic. The servants lived only a few dozen meters from their wealthy employers, but in the nighttime reality, this distance amounted to kilometers. If danger arose, cries for help would be lost in the heavy night air before they could penetrate the thick walls of the grand residences. Moreover, these huts offered virtually no resistance to a determined intrusion. The doors were thin, often mounted on flimsy hinges, and had only rudimentary locks, or none at all. The windows, lacking solid glass, were simple openings framed in wood. During Austin's long, stifling summer months, the humidity and heat became so unbearable inside these poorly ventilated shacks that the occupants were practically forced to sleep with the windows and doors wide open in the desperate hope of catching a refreshing breeze. This vital quest for a breath of fresh air unwittingly transformed into an open invitation for a predator lurking in the shadows. The killer didn't need to shatter noisy windows or force sturdy doors. The path to his victims was wide open, laid out by the harsh weather and the stark architecture. He could slip inside these tiny dwellings with the absolute silence of a ghost. The assassin's psychology was revealed here in its most cowardly and calculating form. He didn't prey on awake targets, capable of defending themselves or raising the alarm. He chose the darkest hour of the night, that moment between midnight and the first light of dawn, when sleep is deepest and heaviest. For these women, broken by hours of grueling physical labor, this sleep wasn't mere rest. It was a state of near unconsciousness brought on by utter exhaustion. They were plunged into a restorative lethargy, completely disconnected from their immediate surroundings, which made them all the more vulnerable to a surprise attack. This monster's modus operandi was of a savagery that defies rational description and went far beyond the simple intention to kill. His approach demonstrated a pathological need to dominate, terrorize, and utterly degrade the human being. Once inside the darkened cabin, standing over his sleeping victim's bed, the killer generally did not strike immediately. A crucial and terrifying element of his macabre ritual consisted of dragging the victim from what should have been her sanctuary. He would pounce on the disoriented woman, often jolted awake in a state of absolute terror, and brutally drag her from her bed. He would drag her roughly across the room, over the threshold, and forcibly take her to the dark courtyard, the backyard, or some secluded spot near the property. This forced relocation into total darkness was not merely a physical maneuver to avoid soiling the room or making noise inside. It was a psychological assault of unimaginable cruelty. The victim, abruptly roused from sleep, was thrust into the frigid nightmare of the Texas night, isolated from any hope of rescue, knowing full well that her cries would likely go unheard or, worse, be deliberately ignored by a society deaf to the distress of its community. Once the victim was isolated outside, under the indifferent gaze of the stars, the killer unleashed an unimaginable destructive fury. It is particularly disturbing to note that he almost never carried sophisticated weapons with him. He displayed a macabre opportunism, using blunt or sharp objects he found at the crime scenes. Heavy axes meant for splitting firewood, thick, rusty kitchen knives, or heavy iron bars lying around in service yards became the instruments of his abomination. The initial attack almost invariably targeted the head. He delivered blows of extreme violence, with the clear aim of immediately incapacitating the victim, destroying any possibility of resistance, and silencing her screams of pain. These major head traumas horribly disfigured the women's faces, erasing their identities in a bloody mess, bearing witness to a visceral hatred and blind rage. But the brutality didn't end there. The murders were accompanied by horrific sexual assaults. The killer did not merely steal these women's lives. He desecrated their bodies with sadistic savagery. The attacks were followed or accompanied by horrific mutilations. Using sharp objects, knives, or pieces of honed metal, he stabbed, tore, and slashed the flesh, transforming the lifeless bodies into scenes of carnage of unimaginable violence. The degree of mutilation suggested a killer who took perverse pleasure in the absolute physical destruction of his prey. The crime scenes, discovered in the early morning by horrified neighbors or employers eager for breakfast, resembled nightmarish visions straight from hell. Blood saturated the dry earth of the gardens, and the bruised bodies bore the marks of prolonged torture and animalistic fury. The socio-political environment of the time undoubtedly played a catalytic role in the freedom of action this killer enjoyed. He fully understood that preying on poor black women in the southern United States in the 1880s amounted, at least initially, to minimal risk. Institutionalized segregation meant that the authorities, predominantly white men, attached only secondary importance to crimes committed within the black community. Police patrols were virtually non-existent in these impoverished neighborhoods. The predator knew that his presence would not raise any alarm, that he could blend into the shadows, observe, plan, and carry out his massacres without fear of being interrupted by an officer's rounds. This systemic indifference served as a shield for the monster, allowing him to refine his methods and increase his deadly confidence night after night. The horror of this situation lies in the utter inability of these women to protect themselves. They couldn't stop working, they couldn't fortify their makeshift shacks, and they certainly couldn't count on the protection of a police force that often treated them like second-class citizens. Every night, they went to bed with the nagging fear that a deadly shadow might slip through the half-open window. Their vulnerability wasn't accidental, it was structural, embedded in the very geography of Austin and the unequal architecture of its nascent society. The handmade annihilator didn't just exploit a flaw in the security of a home, it exploited a gaping chasm in the humanity of an entire society. By preying on these exhausted workers in their fragile nighttime refuges, it brought to light, with unprecedented violence, the silent brutality upon which the comfort of the Texas elite was built. The shadow that fell over Austin stemmed not only from the lack of light in the streets, but from the unfathomable abyss of cruelty that this individual brought with him, transforming lives of hard work into bloody tragedies that would soon paralyze the entire city with unspeakable and unprecedented terror. The year 1884 was drawing to a close, plunging the city of Austin into the biting cold of a Texas winter, a season that would soon become synonymous with absolute horror and mark the beginning of a murderous spiral of terrifying intensity, unprecedented in the nation's history. On December 30th, at the dawn of a new year that promised prosperity and economic growth for the ruling classes, the nightmare suddenly materialized in the form of blind violence, striking the community with an insidious brutality that would leave an indelible psychological scar on the collective unconscious of its inhabitants. The very first victim of this relentless nocturnal predator was Molly Smith, a hardworking young woman of barely 25, who humbly earned her living as a cook, perfectly embodying the profile of the often exploited, shadowy workers upon whom the opulent comfort of the urban elite entirely depended. In the oppressive, icy silence of the winter night, the killer crept like a malevolent shadow into the modest outbuilding where Molly slept soundly, recovering from her long hours of labor. He completely ignored the flimsy locks and thin wooden walls as he entered her most intimate sanctuary. Without giving her the slightest chance of defense, or even time to cry out in alarm, he brought a heavy axe down on her as she lay peacefully in her bed, initiating what would quickly become his unmistakable macabre signature, a torrent of blunt force specifically targeting the skull to eradicate any semblance of consciousness before the victim could even grasp the absolute horror of her grim fate. But the killer's appalling sadism did not end with that first fatal blow, for in a frenzy of unfathomable darkness, a bestial rage beyond simple human comprehension, he dragged the young woman's heavily bloodied body from the small, suffocating room, hauling her roughly across the icy courtyard to abandon her like a piece of garbage in the cold, muddy earth of the outside garden, stripping her of all dignity in death. Her boyfriend, Walter Spencer, who shared the same cramped room that night, suffered horrific injuries in the swift and chaotic attack, narrowly escaping death, but left physically mutilated and psychologically shattered forever by the apocalyptic spectacle he had helplessly and heartbrokenly witnessed. This scene of indescribable carnage, discovered in the early morning under the harsh and unforgiving light of the Texas sun by employers waiting for their meal, caused an initial shockwave that rippled through the community, but many, through denial or ignorance, initially tried to reassure themselves by stubbornly believing that this was an isolated tragic drama of passion, a terrible but singular crime perpetrated by a jealous lover, blindly refusing to see the sinister harbingers of a systematic campaign of terror that would soon engulf the town. The local authorities, tragically incompetent and blinded by the deep racial prejudices of the time, as well as by their total and excusable ignorance of the very concept of a serial killer, directed all their initial investigations towards the usual suspects in the victim circle, simply ignoring the true existence of the anonymous monster who had just tasted human blood and was already meticulously preparing, in the complicit shadows of the night, to strike again with formidable efficiency. For several long, agonizing months, a leaden silence, heavy and charged with an almost imperceptible tension, fell upon the poorer neighborhoods of Austin, allowing the most naive souls to hope that the appalling tragedy of Molly Smith would forever remain a unique event, a horrifying anomaly in the otherwise triumphant rise of the young Texas metropolis. However, this fragile, hard-won illusion of security was brutally and definitively shattered with the gradual return of spring's warmth, when the predator, like a venomous snake emerging from its macabre hibernation, sprang from the darkness to prove to the entire city, petrified with shock, that the true nightmare was, in fact, only just beginning. On May 6, 1885, the murderous shadow fell once again with relentless precision on an isolated outbuilding, this time targeting the innocent Eliza Shelley, another devoted servant whose modest, hard-working life was cut short with the same methodical brutality, the same silent savagery that had so tragically characterized the first major murder of the previous winter. The killer meticulously followed his sinister death script to the letter, slipping silently and with terrifying ease into the dead of night to hack poor Eliza to death with an axe in the privacy of her bedroom, transforming in an instant her well-deserved resting place into a veritable, indescribable slaughterhouse, and confirming beyond a shadow of a doubt that a systematic and ruthless predator was deliberately targeting this specific and highly vulnerable social class. The escalating violence inherent in these crimes was now tragically palpable to anyone willing to look, each new murder pushing the unbearable boundaries of human horror a little further and demonstrating a growing, almost arrogant, confidence in the invisible killer who seemed to revel in the utter and pathetic powerlessness of law enforcement to stop him, anticipate his moves, or even comprehend the abysmal motivations guiding his vengeful hand. Less than 3 weeks later, on May 23rd, as fear began to seep into every dark corner of the city was struck by a new paroxysm of cruelty with the horrific murder of Irene Cross, a brutal attack that highlighted with unbearable clarity a terrifying and unpredictable evolution in the abominable methods of psychological and physical torture employed by the mysterious killer. On that fateful night, the weapon of choice was surprisingly not a heavy blunt axe, but a large, particularly sharp knife, which the diabolical murderer used with bloodthirsty frenzy to stab the unfortunate Irene multiple times, inflicting atrocious wounds before adding to this sickening carnage an absolutely unthinkable act of bodily mutilation by literally scalping his agonizing victim, mercilessly tearing off her scalp with sadistic precision and animal strength that truly chilled the blood of even the most hardened professional investigators in the county. For several long, agonizing months, a leaden silence, heavy and charged with an almost imperceptible tension, fell upon the poorer neighborhoods of Austin, allowing the most naive souls to hope that the appalling tragedy of Molly Smith would forever remain a unique event, a horrifying anomaly in the otherwise triumphant rise of the young Texas metropolis. However, this fragile, hard-won illusion of security was brutally and definitively shattered with the gradual return of spring's warmth, when the predator, like a venomous snake emerging from its macabre hibernation, sprang from the darkness to prove to the entire city, petrified with shock, that the true nightmare was, in fact, only just beginning. On May 6, 1885, the murderous shadow fell once again with relentless precision on an isolated outbuilding, this time targeting the innocent Eliza Shelley, another devoted servant whose modest, hard-working life was cut short with the same methodical brutality, the same silent savagery that had so tragically characterized the first major murder of the previous winter. The killer meticulously followed his sinister death script to the letter, slipping silently and with terrifying ease into the dead of night to hack poor Eliza to death with an axe in the privacy of her bedroom, transforming in an instant her well-deserved resting place into a veritable, indescribable slaughterhouse, and confirming beyond a shadow of a doubt that a systematic and ruthless predator was deliberately targeting this specific and highly vulnerable social class. The escalating violence inherent in these crimes was now tragically palpable to anyone willing to look, each new murder pushing the unbearable boundaries of human horror a little further and demonstrating a growing, almost arrogant, confidence in the invisible killer who seemed to revel in the utter and pathetic powerlessness of law enforcement to stop him, anticipate his moves, or even comprehend the abysmal motivations guiding his vengeful hand. Less than 3 weeks later, on May 23rd, as fear began to seep into every dark corner of the city was struck by a new paroxysm of cruelty with the horrific murder of Irene Cross, a brutal attack that highlighted with unbearable clarity a terrifying and unpredictable evolution in the abominable methods of psychological and physical torture employed by the mysterious killer. On that fateful night, the weapon of choice was surprisingly not a heavy blunt axe, but a large, particularly sharp knife, which the diabolical murderer used with bloodthirsty frenzy to stab the unfortunate Irene multiple times, inflicting atrocious wounds before adding to this sickening carnage an absolutely unthinkable act of bodily mutilation by literally scalping his agonizing victim, mercilessly tearing off her scalp with sadistic precision and animal strength that truly chilled the blood of even the most hardened professional investigators in the county. This grim premonition, shared by the majority of the trembling population, was tragically fulfilled in the most shocking, brutal, and unexpected way possible on the fateful night of December 24th, 1885, a sacred Christmas Eve that immediately entered the nation's dark criminal annals as the most appallingly bloody and intensely terrifying night in the entire history of the state of Texas. On this night dedicated to divine celebration, the merciless annihilator overturned all the behavioral patterns that valiant investigators had been desperately trying to analyze and understand for months, radically altering its usual target and projecting absolute and unspeakable horror directly into the supposedly impregnable and highly secure bastions of the dominant white upper class. The first of these two tragically unexpected and shocking victims was Susan Hancock, a particularly wealthy and highly respected woman belonging fully to the city's financial and social elite, who was savagely attacked in her sleep within the very opulent walls of her luxurious patrician residence, thus definitively and brutally shattering the illusory illusion of absolute security that the majestic walls and guardians of the chic districts were supposed to guarantee flawlessly. The fearsome predator skillfully infiltrated her large home without making the slightest perceptible noise, confirming once again his disturbing and almost supernatural expertise in absolute stealth, before mercilessly striking Susan with a massive, heavy iron bar which he violently and cruelly drove through her head, reproducing the same type of fatal and devastating head trauma that so sadly characterized the horrific murders of the previous handmaids, formally proving to all skeptics that it was undoubtedly the same murderous hand, guided by the same destructive madness. But the absolute horror of that infernal Christmas night unfortunately did not stop at this first atrocity, because in an extremely short period of time that almost defied spatial logic, the enraged killer quickly crossed the sleeping city to strike a second time with the same intensity, this time attacking the beautiful Eula Phillips, another white woman from a very privileged social background, whose atrociously tragic fate sealed the abysmal despair of an entire community that had been divided until then. Eula was brutally surprised by the frenzied assassin and literally massacred with an axe right there in the elegant courtyard of her vast bourgeois estate, suffering an extreme and degrading level of bodily mutilation that painfully recalled the worst hours of that nightmarish year. The elusive killer thus displaying to the world his most total and profound contempt for human life by transforming a luxurious and private domestic space into a veritable scene of carnage of visceral and unimaginable brutality. The simultaneous and distressing discovery of these two horrific murders on Christmas morning, a day meant to celebrate love and hope, had the devastating effect of a cataclysmic explosion on the already fragile collective psyche of the city of Austin, erasing in a single, lightning-fast instant all tenacious social barriers and racial boundaries in the face of the emergence of a universal and democratized terror for the ruling elite, who until then had observed the continuous slaughter of the Black working class with a certain distance tinged with indifference, suddenly and brutally found themselves plunged into the very heart of the bloody nightmare, realizing with paralyzing horror that material wealth, high social status, and dominant ethnicity offered absolutely no guarantees or protective immunity against this implacable demon that prowled freely in the sticky darkness of their beautiful city. All joyous festivities were abruptly and sadly canceled. The traditional joy of Christmas was immediately swallowed up by a paralyzing collective hysteria, the city's majestic churches filled with grieving worshippers not to joyfully celebrate the Nativity, but to bitterly mourn their dead and pray fervently for swift divine deliverance. While the major commercial arteries and residential streets emptied completely as soon as the dreaded night fell, the completely terrified citizens, barricading themselves frantically behind multiple metal locks, holding loaded firearms in trembling hands, waiting in the dullest and most trying anguish for the next murderous move of an invisible, methodical, and seemingly invincible adversary. This particularly symbolic and bloody double massacre on Christmas Eve undoubtedly marked the dramatic culmination of the infamous Handmaid Annihilator's destructive work, thus concluding a whole year of terrifying and uninterrupted carnage that had left behind a desolate trail of horribly mutilated bodies, innocent families destroyed forever, and psychologically broken survivors, elevating this mysterious assassin to the unenviable rank of a true mythological bogeyman, a pure, primitive, and totally elusive evil force that had achieved the macabre feat of holding an entire American city hostage psychologically, publicly and openly exposing the extreme fragility of modern civilization and police institutions in the face of the sudden and devastating emergence of an absolute, radical, and fundamentally incomprehensible human evil. Faced with this unprecedented wave of terror that threatened to completely paralyze the city and permanently destroy the social fabric of the community, Austin's local authorities found themselves tragically overwhelmed by the scale of events, revealing the utter inadequacy of their traditional investigative methods in the face of crime of such magnitude. The city's police force, led by officials who sorely lacked specialized training and appropriate scientific tools, quickly descended into utter disarray, desperately groping in the dark without the slightest methodological compass to guide them. During this critical period, the initial steps of the investigation were immediately tainted by deeply entrenched racial biases and a myriad of monumental errors that would forever compromise any chance of discovering the monster's true identity. In the early months of the murder spree, when the victims were almost exclusively Black working-class women, investigators displayed a culpable laxity tinged with institutional racism, refusing to consider the existence of a methodical serial killer and preferring to attribute these barbaric crimes to internal power struggles within the African American community. Guided by this narrow and biased view, the police arbitrarily arrested dozens of Black men, indiscriminately suspecting husbands, partners, ex-partners, or mere acquaintances of the victims, subjecting them to brutal interrogations and prolonged detentions without ever managing to extract a single confession or gather a shred of incriminating physical evidence, thus demonstrating the utter futility of their initial leads. It must be strongly emphasized that at this pivotal time in the late 19th century, the modern techniques of criminal investigation that we now take for granted simply did not yet exist. Forensic DNA analysis was not even a science fiction concept, and dactyloscopy, that is, identification by fingerprints, had not yet been adopted or even conceptualized as a standard method of law enforcement. Investigators in 1885 had to rely almost exclusively on fragile and fleeting clues, such as vague footprints left in the soft earth around crime scenes, extremely contradictory and highly unreliable eyewitness accounts from terrified neighbors who had only glimpsed fleeting figures in the darkness, and above all, on personal intuitions often dictated by the prevailing panic and the immense political pressures exerted by a population on the verge of exploding. Faced with increasingly harsh criticism from the local press and growing public anger, the city council finally reacted by releasing significant funds to drastically strengthen law enforcement, going so far as to offer substantial financial rewards for any decisive information leading to the capture of the killer, and even bringing in renowned tracking dog teams from other states to try to pick up the killer's scent trail. Unfortunately, even these extraordinary measures resulted in resounding and repeated failures. The detectives, hampered by the agitation of curious crowds who trampled the crime scenes daily before the arrival of the authorities, were never able to follow a reliable lead consistently, while the intensive night patrols, composed of exhausted police officers scouring the muddy alleyways by the light of flickering lanterns, proved totally powerless to intercept a predator who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to blend into the darkness and anticipate the slightest movement of the security forces. The leads multiplied each week, only to end up in hopeless dead ends. As the months passed, a bitter conviction grew among the population that the police were fundamentally incapable of protecting them, gradually transforming the quest for justice into a slow descent into hell marked by institutional impotence, collective frustration, and a visceral fear of an invisible danger that continued to defy the entire judicial system of the time with impunity. Amid this widespread chaos and complete lack of clear direction, investigators nevertheless attempted to explore various theories to explain the inexplicable, compiling a list of potential suspects, some of whose names would haunt American criminal history for decades, yet none of them could be formally charged due to the glaring absence of tangible evidence. Among these suspicious figures who fueled the court chronicles of the time was the enigmatic profile of Malay Cook, a cook of Malay origin working in Austin's food establishments during the critical period of the murders, whose strange behavior and sudden departure from the city immediately after the bloody double Christmas Eve massacre aroused legitimate suspicions, to the point that some daring researchers later put forward the disturbing hypothesis that he might have left Texas to settle in London and perpetrate the infamous Jack the Ripper crimes under another identity a few years later, although no factual link has ever been scientifically proven. Other leads focused on the immediate circle of the victims, notably the husbands of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, who were successively arrested, imprisoned, and subjected to intense questioning by prosecutors desperate to find a culprit to present to a public thirsting for justice, before finally being released and cleared of any wrongdoing due to a blatant lack of evidence to support a formal charge in court. But the most weighty name, the one that has stirred the most passionate debate and retrospective analysis among crime historians, remains without question that of Nathan Elgin, a 19-year-old black man working as a butcher in the local slaughterhouses, renowned for his Herculean physical strength and extremely violent behavior, who met a tragic and abrupt end in February 1886 when he was shot dead in the street by police officers after violently attacking a woman with a knife, a violent death that curiously coincided with the complete and definitive end of the series of axe murders that terrorized the city, prompting many observers of the time to see in him the long-sought face of the monster. Yet, despite the unsettling temporal coincidence of his death and the immediate cessation of the attacks, the mystery remained unsolved because no definitive physical evidence ever formally linked Nathan Elgin to all the murders committed between 1884 and 1885, leaving a persistent and frustrating doubt about the killer's true identity. The chaotic handling of this monumental investigation thus became a prime example of systemic failure in the face of a crime ahead of its time, where the lack of identification technology, the pervasiveness of racial barriers, and the structural incompetence of law enforcement combined their perverse effects to transform a criminal investigation into a dead-end labyrinth, forever sealing the tragic fate of these poor women in the limbo of judicial oblivion and depriving grieving families of even the slightest shred of consolation or truth. The legal chapter of this murky affair ultimately never saw a proper courtroom or a resounding final plea because the investigation, undermined by its own failings and the complete absence of irrefutable physical evidence, reached a definitive dead end without any suspect ever being formally sent to trial before a jury to answer for their abominable crimes. While one might have expected a landmark trial capable of healing, at least in part, the immense wounds of a community deeply scarred by a whole year of carnage and nighttime terror, the institutional reality proved almost as ruthless as the acts committed by the murderer himself. The Travis County courts, accustomed to handling minor offenses and everyday violent cases in a Texas undergoing rapid transformation, found themselves utterly helpless in the face of such a massive serial crime, unable to build a solid case based on mere conjecture, contradictory eyewitness accounts gathered in the dim light, or olfactory clues obscured by the panic of the crowds. The few individuals apprehended during this long and chaotic year-long manhunt, including grieving spouses and marginalized figures wrongly targeted by public outrage and pressure from the local press, were ultimately released quietly due to a complete lack of evidence, thus closing the prison doors without any sentence ever being handed down in the name of law and justice. This complete absence of a formal trial left a deafening legal void, depriving the victims' families and the entire population of that essential cathartic moment when the truth finally comes to light, clearly identifying those responsible and offering a semblance of moral closure. Police files gathered dust in the drawers of the Austin police station, transforming botched investigations into mere administrative reports shelved without further action, while the public, initially eager for exemplary punishment, had to accept with a sense of bitterness and unspeakable frustration that the justice system had utterly failed in its most fundamental mission. No prosecutor could deliver a closing argument, no judge could wield a solemn gavel to condemn the guilty party, and no courtroom bench heard the chilling confession of a killer cornered by the evidence, for the true culprit had achieved the macabre feat of vanishing forever into the mists of history, taking all his dark secrets to the grave. Human justice, hampered by the racial prejudices of its time, by the archaism of scientific methods, and by a manifest structural incompetence, thus proved powerless from beginning to end, leaving behind a lingering sense of incompleteness and an open wound at the heart of American jurisprudence. The absence of a trial also deprived future historians and criminologists of the essential technical documents that usually allow for an analysis of the deep psychology of a predator of this caliber, reducing speculation about his identity to mere hypotheses impossible to verify in a court of law. The names of those suspected, from Malay Cook to Nathan Elgin and the desperate couple, thus remained suspended in a permanent legal limbo, neither fully exonerated by a formal decision nor ever found guilty by a jury, perpetuating an unbearable gray area that would fuel urban legends and macabre tales for over a century. When the guns fell silent and the frenzied search waned in the face of the impenetrable wall of silence, the city of Austin had to confront the bitter truth that the perfect crime did indeed exist, not through premeditated genius, but through the tragic conjunction of institutional negligence and social indifference. The courts therefore had no choice but to close the cases permanently, acknowledging by their impotence one of the most crushing and humiliating failures in Texas judicial history, a failure that still resonates today as a cruel reminder of the tragic inability of the society of that time to protect the most vulnerable among us and to hold accountable those who shatter lives in the darkness of night. The legacy of this dark period in Austin's history proved as profound as it was lasting, irrevocably transforming the urban landscape and the collective imagination of a city desperately seeking to heal its gaping wounds after the devastating storms of 1884 and 1885. Faced with widespread panic and the evident inability of night patrols to secure the streets in total darkness, the city government had to take measures of unprecedented architectural scope to try to reassure a terrified population and deprive the mysterious predator of its most valuable ally, the impenetrable shadows of unlit alleyways. This is how one of the most fascinating and unique features of Austin's urban landscape came about: the monumental installation of the famous Moonlight Towers, gigantic metal structures rising over 50 meters high, crowned with powerful electric arc lamps designed to bathe the entire city in a continuous artificial glow, virtually indistinguishable from a permanent moonlight. These futuristic towers, initially commissioned to eliminate the shadowy areas where the killer could so easily blend in, radically transformed Austin's nighttime atmosphere, banishing the menacing darkness and restoring to citizens a precarious but essential sense of security when they had to venture out after sunset. Even today, Austin proudly preserves this unique heritage, standing out as the last city in the world to maintain and preserve these historic towers, which now stand as silent monuments, a reminder of both the ingenuity of a city at the mercy of the times and the visceral terror that motivated their construction at a time when human life seemed to hang by a thread. Beyond this physical transformation of the cityscape, the cultural and literary impact of this series of unsolved murders has profoundly marked local history, finding an immortal echo in the writings of one of the most celebrated authors of his generation, William Sidney Porter, who lived in Austin at the very heart of this macabre turmoil and who, under his world-renowned pseudonym O. Henry, immortalized the terror of his fellow citizens by committing the sinister and definitive name of Servant Girl Annihilator to paper for the first time in a private letter dated 1885. This chilling name, forged in the urgency of fear and shock, has endured through the decades to become the universal symbol of this criminal enigma, forever etching into the annals of American criminology the memory of these vulnerable women whose tragedy was eclipsed by the impenetrable mystery of their tormentor. The fact that the crimes stopped as abruptly as they had begun, without any judgment to close the cases, and without any perpetrator ever being brought to justice, left behind an abysmal void, a permanent scar on the soul of a community that has never been able to find the peace of mind that justice brings. The victims' families, predominantly from the Black and marginalized working class, were doubly betrayed by history. First, by the cruel indifference of a society that was slow to react to their plight as long as the violence only affected domestic workers in their backyard shacks. And second, by the complete inability of the judicial system to formally identify the monster who had snatched their loved ones away amidst general indifference. This resounding failure of the police and judicial apparatus has become a tragic case study, poignantly illustrating the worst flaws of a system incapable of protecting the most vulnerable and decades behind the evolution of scientific investigation methods that could have changed the course of history. Looking back, through the relentless lens of time and historical analysis, we realize that the handmade annihilator not only destroyed individual lives by smashing skulls with axes and mutilating bodies in the mud of Texas backyards, but also laid bare the fundamental hypocrisy of a rapidly expanding modern society, built upon foundations of racial inequality and social segregation that the predator's blind violence brutally swept away in the space of a bloody Christmas. The shadows that those infamous moonlight towers were meant to dispel were not only those of Austin's dark alleyways, but also those of the neglect and denial to which the city had relegated its most vulnerable citizens, the housekeepers and cooks who kept the economy running without ever receiving the basic protections that every state owes its citizens. The mystery surrounding the true identity of the killer, whether it was Malay Cook, Nathan Elgin, or some other anonymous figure who managed to take his terrible secret to the grave, remains to this day one of the greatest unsolved enigmas in the annals of American crime, wrongly overshadowed later by the international notoriety of Jack the Ripper in London. Even though the modus operandi of the Austin killer displayed an equally abject savagery and an equally chilling premeditation. In closing this dark and painful chapter of American history, it is incumbent upon us not to succumb to a morbid fascination with acts of gratuitous cruelty, but to restore with dignity the memory of these innocent women, from Molly Smith to Eula Phillips, ensuring that their names are never erased by the steamrollers of time, and constantly bearing in mind that their tragedy remains an eternal reminder of the fragility of civilization in the face of barbarity lurking in the shadows. A lesson in humility and vigilance that the city of Austin, illuminated by its eternal towers of light, now carries as a silent and indelible warning for future generations. As we step back from the blood-soaked streets of 1885 Austin and look across the vast expanse of time that separates our modern era from those terrifying months, we are forced to confront the enduring ghosts of a case that refuses to find closure. The passage of more than a century has done little to diminish the raw, unsettling power of the servant girl annihilator murders. Instead, the decades have transformed a localized 19th century nightmare into a foundational study in the evolution of criminal pathology, systemic vulnerability, and the haunting limits of historical memory. When we re-examine the totality of the tragedy, we are not merely looking at a string of unsolved homicides. We are staring directly into a profound mirror that reflects the deepest structural fractures of a society undergoing rapid, turbulent transformation. The narrative of the Austin Axe murders challenges us to look beyond the sensationalized shock value of the crimes and to reckon with the human cost borne by those whom history so often prefers to render invisible. Throughout this extensive journey into the dark heart of early Austin, we have traced the meticulous operational rhythm of a predator who understood the geographical and social layout of the city with terrifying clarity. We have walked the muddy service lanes behind the opulent mansions, stood in the oppressive heat of the modest servant quarters, and felt the suffocating dread that gripped a population sleeping with doors and windows wide open in a desperate, futile quest for air. We have witnessed the horrifying sequence of events that unfolded from the chilling murder of Molly Smith on the threshold of 1885 all the way to the apocalyptic double massacre on Christmas Eve that shattered the protected sanctuary of the city's white elite. Yet, for all the detailed reconstruction of these atrocities, for all the frantic investigations, false arrests, and desperate theories involving Malay Cook, Nathan Elgin, or anonymous shadowy figures, the central void remains absolute. The identity of the monster has been permanently swallowed by the mists of history, leaving us to grapple with a legacy built entirely on absence, silence, and unanswered questions. This lingering ambiguity is precisely what elevates the Austin murders from a forgotten historical curiosity to an iconic milestone in the annals of true crime. Long before the term serial killer entered the common lexicon, before criminal profilers studied signature behaviors, and long before forensic science could extract a story from a microscopic trace of evidence, this unidentified predator was already executing a masterclass in psychological warfare and calculated violence. The parallels that modern researchers draw between the servant girl annihilator and the subsequent terror of Jack the Ripper in London are striking, yet they also reveal a fundamental divergence in how society responds to trauma. While Whitechapel became an international obsession, inspiring endless literary analysis and cultural fixation, the carnage in Austin remained largely marginalized in the national consciousness for generations, overshadowed by the racial dynamics and regional biases of a post-Reconstruction American South. The victims in Austin were predominantly poor Black women, domestic laborers whose lives and deaths were systematically undervalued by the institutions charged with their protection. This painful historical reality underscores a vital truth about the nature of serial predation. Monsters do not simply operate in a vacuum. They exploit the existing fault lines, prejudices, and blind spots of the communities they prey upon. The investigation itself serves as a sobering cautionary tale about the catastrophic dangers of institutional tunnel vision and systemic bias. When law enforcement agencies are blinded by prejudice, looking only for suspects within marginalized communities while ignoring the broader, terrifying reality of a coordinated predator, justice becomes an impossible illusion. The dozens of wrongful arrests, the brutal interrogations of grieving husbands, and the utter failure to secure a single viable prosecution stand as a permanent indictment of a judicial apparatus unequipped and unwilling to extend its full protection to every citizen. The reliance on primitive investigative techniques, rumor, speculation, footprint tracking, and forced confessions demonstrates just how far criminal justice has evolved, while simultaneously reminding us of how fragile the rule of law can be when tested by an unprecedented evil. The tragedy of the Austin murders is compounded exponentially by the fact that the families of the victims were denied even the modest comfort of a courtroom verdict, a formal acknowledgement of guilt, or a definitive moment of closure. They were forced to carry the crushing weight of their grief in silence, navigating a world that had implicitly signaled that their lives mattered less in the grand ledger of municipal progress. Yet, out of this profound darkness and institutional failure, the city of Austin forged a physical and cultural resilience that persists to this day. The towering structures of the Moonlight Towers, erected in the frantic aftermath of the slaughter to banish the shadows where the predator once lurked, stand today as the world's last surviving monument to an era of absolute panic. These 50-meter metal spires, casting their amber glow across the modern, bustling cityscape of contemporary Austin, are much more than a quirky historical landmark or a testament to late 19th century engineering. They are glowing sentinels of memory, silent witnesses to a time when a community realized that its survival depended upon bringing the dark places into the light. Every time a modern resident or a curious traveler looks up at these towering beacons, they are unknowingly gazing at the direct physical legacy of the servant girl annihilator, a permanent reminder that the city's vibrant present was forged in the crucible of an unimaginable, unpunished nightmare. In the realm of literature and popular culture, the impact of these events found an equally indelible expression through the perceptive eye of William Sidney Porter, who would later achieve global renown as the master storyteller O. Henry. By capturing the chilling essence of the murders in his private correspondence and coining the moniker that would forever bind the unknown killer to his horrific deeds, Porter ensured that the trauma of 1884 and 1885 would not simply evaporate into the ether of forgotten local gossip. His choice of words was brutally precise, acknowledging that this was not merely a sequence of random crimes, but a systematic eradication of a vulnerable demographic. As we reflect on his literary legacy and the countless retellings that have kept this dark chapter alive in the true crime community, we are reminded of the heavy responsibility carried by those who document real-world horrors. It is an ethical imperative that transcends mere entertainment or sensationalism, demanding that our primary focus remains steadfastly centered on the victims rather than the elusive shadow of the villain. When we strip away the myths, the sensational rumors of transatlantic escapes, and the grim folklore that has grown around the case over the past century and a half, we are left with the heartbreaking human reality of the individuals whose lives were extinguished so violently. Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips were not merely data points in a criminological timeline or stepping stones in the evolution of serial murder studies. They were daughters, mothers, workers, and human beings with hopes, dreams, and quiet daily struggles that were abruptly cut short by a merciless force of destruction. They endured unimaginable terror in their final moments, wrenched from their sleep and dragged into the cold Texas night by a predator who left them stripped of their dignity and their future. To remember them properly is to honor their humanity, refusing to let their stories be swallowed completely by the anonymity of the unsolved file. The closing of the files on the servant girl annihilator did not bring peace. It simply marked the beginning of an eternal historical enigma. The killer took his secrets to the grave, evading earthly justice and leaving behind a trail of blood that washes against the shores of our modern fascination with true crime. As listeners and chroniclers of these dark histories, we are left to wander through the labyrinth of possibilities, questioning how such an evil could operate with such absolute impunity and vanish without a trace. The silence that fell over Austin in the early months of 1886, following the sudden cessation of the brutal attacks and the violent death of Nathan Elgin, offered no real answers, only a profound, echoing emptiness. It was a quiet born not of resolution, but of exhaustion, a city simply too tired, too traumatized, and too eager to bury its deepest traumas to keep searching for a ghost that had already dissolved into the deep southern night. As we bring this deep, exhaustive exploration of the Austin Axe murders to a close, we must carry with us the weight of the lessons embedded in this harrowing narrative. The story of the servant girl annihilator reminds us of the delicate fragility of human safety, the dangerous consequences of systemic indifference toward marginalized populations, and the haunting reality that some monsters are never unmasked. It challenges us to look closely at the shadows that linger in our own modern societies, urging us to remain vigilant, empathetic, and relentlessly committed to the pursuit of truth and justice for the vulnerable. The lights of the Moonlight Towers continue to pierce the Texas darkness, casting their steady glow upon a city that has grown, evolved, and transformed beyond all recognition, yet forever anchored to the dark winter nights of 1884. The phantom of Austin has long since vanished, but the echoes of his terror remain, whispering from the pages of history as an eternal, haunting reminder of the darkness that can dwell within the human heart when the world is fast asleep. As we continue our profound exploration into the shadows of 1885 and the enduring enigma of the Austin Axe murders, we find ourselves compelled to examine how this foundational tragedy reshaped the very architecture of human fear and criminal investigation. The passage of time often softens the edges of historical horrors, turning raw, bleeding wounds into distant folklore, yet the case of the servant girl annihilator resists this sanitizing effect with a stubborn, unsettling resilience. When we look past the immediate timeline of the crimes, beyond the initial wave of panic and the subsequent institutional failure of the police force, we uncover a complex web of sociological and psychological realities that continue to haunt modern criminologists. This was an era when the concept of a serial killer did not exist, meaning that both law enforcement and the general public were entirely unequipped to process a predator who killed not for material gain, not out of sudden passion, but purely for the gratification of destruction and terror. The absence of a recognized framework for serial predation meant that the people of Austin were forced to invent their own understanding of evil on the fly, wrestling with a terror that seemed to defy all rational explanation and human comprehension. The psychological impact on the community extended far beyond the immediate circle of the victims' families, permeating every layer of daily life in a city that was desperately trying to project an image of modern progress and Southern sophistication. Wealthy landowners and impoverished domestic workers alike shared a common denominator of vulnerability, even if that vulnerability was grossly unevenly distributed across racial and economic lines. For the affluent white citizens, the illusion of safety provided by their grand mansions was shattered forever on that fateful Christmas Eve when the killer breached the inner sanctum of the upper class. For the Black community, whose members bore the brunt of the early massacres, the terror was compounded by a bitter, pervasive sense of institutional abandonment. They knew that their lives were treated as secondary by a legal system that viewed them through the distorted lens of prejudice and suspicion. This dual reality created a deeply fractured society, where a common enemy failed to unite a population that remained bitterly divided by racial inequality, even as they trembled together in the dark. The psychological scars left by this atmosphere of mutual distrust and universal dread took generations to heal, permanently altering the collective identity of Austin and embedding a dark, cautionary subtext into the city's otherwise sunny historical narrative. In the broader context of American criminal history, the Austin murders occupy a unique and troubling position that deserves far more academic and public attention than it historically received. While the shadow of Jack the Ripper would soon loom large over the global imagination, creating an enduring blueprint for the anonymous urban monster, the Austin Predator was already operating with a level of chilling anonymity and calculated cruelty that anticipated the darkest elements of 20th century true crime. The similarities in methodology, the deliberate targeting of vulnerable women in their own domestic spaces, the use of crude and opportunistic weapons, and the sudden, unexplained cessation of the crimes all point to a criminal profile that modern behavioral analysts study with intense fascination. Yet, because the crimes occurred in Texas rather than London, and because the initial victims were marginalized women of color, the case was relegated to the margins of national historical consciousness for decades. This historical oversight serves as a sobering reminder of how historical memory is often shaped by privilege and geography, leaving vital chapters of our collective past obscured by the biases of the eras that recorded them. The evolution of forensic science and investigative methodology owes a quiet, grim debt to the catastrophic failures witnessed in Austin during those 18 terrifying months. When investigators stumble blindly through a crime scene, contaminating vital evidence, yielding to political pressure, and arresting dozens of innocent individuals out of sheer desperation, they create a negative template of what not to do. The complete lack of physical evidence preservation, the absence of fingerprint technology, and the heavy reliance on forced confessions and racial profiling demonstrated the urgent need for a systematic, scientific approach to law enforcement. Modern detectives analyzing the cold case files of the Servant Girl Annihilator are often struck by the sheer volume of lost opportunities, traces of evidence that could have been analyzed, footprints that could have been cast, and witness accounts that could have been rigorously vetted if the institutional framework of the 19th century had possessed the tools we take for granted today. The tragedy of the victims is thus magnified by the technological and systemic limitations of their time, locked forever in an unsolvable puzzle because the mechanisms of justice were simply not advanced enough to decode the killer's silent language. As we reflect on the legacy of this dark chapter, we must also consider the profound ethical responsibilities inherent in the true crime genre itself. It is dangerously easy for modern audiences, distanced by more than a century of time, to consume these historical tragedies as mere entertainment, treating real human suffering with a detached, voyeuristic curiosity. The blood-soaked details, the brutal mutilations, and the haunting atmosphere of a 19th century southern city under siege can easily become reduced to sensationalized ghost stories told around a campfire. We must actively resist this impulse by anchoring our focus firmly where it belongs, on the humanity of the victims whose lives were so violently extinguished. Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips were not characters in a macabre fiction. They were daughters, sisters, workers, and human beings with vibrant inner lives, legitimate hopes for the future, and families who loved them. Their brutal deaths robbed them of their rightful tomtaus and left behind a legacy of unresolved grief that deserves to be remembered with solemn dignity and profound respect. The physical landscape of Austin today bears silent witness to this haunting history, most notably through the enduring presence of the moonlight towers that pierce the Texas night sky with their amber glow. These towering monuments of engineering, erected in direct response to the absolute panic of 1885, serve as a daily, visible link between our modern, bustling metropolis and the terrified city of the past. Every time a citizen walks beneath their light, they are walking through a space designed to banish the very shadows that once sheltered a ruthless predator. Yet, no amount of electric light can fully illuminate the dark corridors of human history or explain the impenetrable mystery of why a man could commit such unspeakable atrocities and vanish without a trace. The ghost of the Austin axe murderer remains a permanent fixture of local folklore, a shadowy reminder of the fragile boundary that separates civilized society from primal chaos. In the final analysis, the story of the servant girl annihilator is not merely a tale of unsolved murders or historical curiosities. It is an enduring meditation on the capacity for human cruelty, the systemic frailties of justice, and the resilience of communities forced to confront unimaginable horror. The files may be closed, the trails may have gone cold centuries ago, and the identity of the monster may be forever lost to the mists of time, but the echoes of his terror continue to reverberate through the quiet hours of the night. As we close this exhaustive examination of a deeply troubled era, we are left with a quiet, lingering reminder that history is written not only by the victors and the progress makers, but also by the victims whose silent struggles and tragic ends demand our eternal remembrance, ensuring that their stories are never truly forgotten in the deep southern night. As we venture even further into the profound historical shadows cast by the events of 1884 and 1885 in Austin, Texas, we must confront the subtle ways in which this terrifying narrative has woven itself into the fabric of American folklore. The passage of nearly a century and a half has not diluted the chilling essence of the servant girl annihilator case. Rather, it has allowed the legend to crystallize into a cautionary tale about the dark underbelly of human progress. When a rapidly modernizing city is suddenly confronted by a predator who operates outside the boundaries of conventional criminality, the collective psyche of its inhabitants undergoes a permanent fracture. The illusion of safety that comes with wealth, industrial expansion, and municipal growth is violently stripped away, leaving behind a stark, unsettling realization that civilization is always walking a razor-thin edge above a primordial abyss. The residents of Austin learned this harsh lesson in the most brutal manner imaginable, watching helplessly as the quiet sanctuary of their homes was transformed into scenes of unimaginable carnage by a ghost who left nothing behind except broken bodies and lingering dread. The enduring fascination with this dark chapter of true crime history speaks volumes about our psychological need to comprehend the incomprehensible. Human beings possess an inherent drive to find order in chaos, to seek logical patterns and clear resolutions to stories that end in tragedy. Yet the Austin axe murders offer no such comfort, no neat narrative bow to tie up the loose ends of an agonizing investigation. The complete absence of a definitive perpetrator, the failure of the justice system to secure a conviction, and the sudden, unexplained cessation of the bloodshed leave an intellectual void that historians, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts have tried to fill for generations. We desperately want to know who held the axe, what drove them to such heights of sadistic frenzy, and how they managed to slip away into the Texas night without ever facing earthly retribution. This perpetual quest for answers keeps the memory of the victims alive, ensuring that their tragic stories are not entirely lost to the sweeping currents of time, even if the ultimate truth remains forever obscured by the impenetrable mists of the past. When we reflect upon the victims themselves, we are reminded of the heavy ethical burden carried by those who chronicle real-world tragedies. It is tragically easy in the modern true crime landscape for individual human lives to be reduced to mere statistics, stepping stones in a chronological timeline of horror, or sensationalized elements of a campfire ghost story. We must actively resist this dehumanizing tendency by continually returning our focus to the real people whose existence was so cruelly cut short. Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips were not background players in a macabre drama. They were daughters, sisters, workers, and individuals with rich, complex inner lives and dreams for the future that mattered just as much as those of the wealthy elite. Their violent deaths robbed them of their rightful tomorrows and inflicted a profound, lasting trauma on their surviving loved ones, who had to navigate a world that offered them little sympathy and even less institutional protection. Honoring their memory requires us to look past the gore and confront the systemic inequalities that made them so dangerously vulnerable to a predator who exploited their societal station. The sociological dimensions of the Austin murders provide a critical lens through which we can examine the deeply entrenched prejudices of the post-Reconstruction American South. The initial phase of the slaughter, which targeted almost exclusively impoverished Black women working as domestic servants, met with a disheartening level of institutional indifference and societal neglect. The authorities of the era, reflecting the prevailing racial biases of their community, were quick to suspect members of the marginalized community itself while remaining largely blind to the broader, systemic nature of the threat. It was only when the violence crossed arbitrary racial and economic boundaries on that fateful Christmas Eve, striking at the heart of the affluent white elite through the murders of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, that the city descended into a state of total, unadulterated panic. This stark contrast in societal response lays bare an uncomfortable truth about the valuation of human life during that era, exposing a hierarchy of grief, where some tragedies commanded immediate outrage while others were pushed to the suffocating periphery of public consciousness. The evolution of criminal justice and investigative science also finds a poignant, albeit painful, anchor in the failures of the 1885 Austin Police Department. Operating in an era devoid of forensic tools, fingerprint databases, and structured psychological profiling, law enforcement officers were utterly unequipped to track a predator who utilized stealth and psychological terror with such devastating efficiency. The frantic arrests of dozens of innocent individuals, the contamination of critical crime scenes by curious mobs, and the heavy reliance on forced confessions and racial profiling highlight the catastrophic dangers of an investigative framework driven by desperation and prejudice rather than objective methodology. Modern law enforcement agencies look back at the Servant Girl Annihilator case as a prime example of institutional helplessness, a cautionary benchmark that underscores how far forensic science and investigative protocols have advanced over the past century. The tragedy of the unsolved murders is thus amplified by the realization that the technological and systematic limitations of the 19th century actively conspired to let a monster slip through the net of justice. The physical and cultural landscape of contemporary Austin continues to bear the indelible scars of this terrifying period, most vividly embodied by the towering moonlight towers that still pierce the night sky with their amber luminescence. These unique architectural anomalies, born out of desperate municipal efforts to eliminate the dark hiding places of an elusive killer and restore a semblance of security to a terrified populace, stand today as silent, glowing testaments to a city's collective trauma. They remind modern citizens and curious travelers alike of a time when the simple act of stepping outside after sunset required an extraordinary measure of courage, and when the night was regarded not as a time for peaceful rest, but as a realm ruled by an invisible and terrifying phantom. These 50-meter metal structures are far more than quirky historical landmarks or relics of late 19th century engineering. They are enduring monuments to human resilience, casting their steady illumination across a bustling, modern metropolis, while keeping alive the memory of the dark winter nights that forged their creation. The literary legacy of the case is equally profound, anchored forever by the perceptive observations of William Sidney Porter, who captured the atmospheric dread of 1885 in his personal correspondence under the famous pen name O. Henry. By coining the chilling moniker that permanently linked the unidentified monster to his methodical campaign of destruction, Porter ensured that the trauma would not dissolve into mere local folklore. His descriptive precision highlighted the systematic nature of the violence, giving a distinct linguistic shape to an urban nightmare that defied easy explanation. Writers and researchers who followed in his footsteps have continued to grapple with the case, treating it as a foundational touchstone in the evolution of American true crime storytelling. This ongoing literary and historical engagement demonstrates our enduring need to examine the darkest corners of our past, ensuring that even when justice is denied and files are permanently closed, the stories of those who suffered are never fully erased from the collective memory of society. As we bring this extensive and solemn exploration of the Austin Axe murders to its conclusion, we are left with a quiet, lingering resonance that transcends the boundaries of time and place. The story of the servant girl annihilator remains an open wound in the historical fabric of the United States, a chilling reminder of the fragility of human safety and the devastating consequences of systemic indifference toward the vulnerable. The mystery of the killer's identity will likely never be solved, and the true motives behind his reign of terror will remain forever locked behind the silent gates of history. Yet, in spite of the darkness that enveloped Austin during those fateful 18 months, the city persevered, transforming its profound terror into an enduring monument of light and resilience. The echoes of that distant winter continue to whisper through the shadows of the modern world, urging us to maintain our empathy, our vigilance, and our unwavering commitment to justice, ensuring that the victims of the past are honored with the eternal respect and remembrance they so deeply deserve. We must ultimately recognize that true crime narratives are not merely entertainments designed to satisfy our morbid curiosity, but profound explorations of the human condition in its most extreme and vulnerable states. The legacy of the Austin murders challenges us to look beyond the surface level of historical shock and confront the structural realities that permit evil to flourish in the dark. By keeping the memories of Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips alive, we reclaim their humanity from the cold anonymity of unsolved case files. They deserved safety, dignity, and a future that was stolen from them by a heartless predator. As the amber glow of the Moonlight Towers continues to watch over the vibrant streets of Austin today, it serves as an eternal guardian of their memory, reminding us forever of the shadows we must constantly strive to conquer. As we arrive at the ultimate horizon of this harrowing historical journey into the dark winter nights of 1884 and 1885 in Austin, Texas, we are compelled to look beyond the immediate boundaries of the unsolved files and gaze directly into the profound, enduring legacy of a terror that permanently reshaped an American city. The story of the servant girl annihilator is not merely a collection of grim anecdotes or a historical curiosity to be filed away in the dusty cabinets of forgotten archives. It is a solemn testament to the profound fragility of human existence and the devastating ease with which the thin veneer of civilization can be stripped away by an unbridled, anonymous force of destruction. When we trace the long, winding path from that first fatal blow delivered to Molly Smith in the chilling twilight of the dying year to the apocalyptic double massacre that shattered the peaceful sanctuary of Christmas Eve, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable and enduring truth about the nature of historical memory. History is so often written through the triumphant lens of progress, industrial expansion, and municipal success, deliberately casting its dark shadows over the vulnerabilities and sufferings of those who do not belong to the privileged elites. Yet, true historical reckoning requires us to shine a relentless light into those very shadows, giving voice and dignity to individuals who were systematically marginalized in life and nearly forgotten in death. The victims of this unidentified predator were women whose daily labor sustained the opulent lifestyles of Austin's wealthiest residents, yet whose safety and humanity were tragically undervalued by the institutions charged with their protection. By keeping their names alive, Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips, we actively resist the cruel erasure of time, reclaiming their individual identities from the cold anonymity of an unsolved case file and honoring their memory with a deep respect, empathy, and solemn remembrance they so profoundly deserve. Throughout this extensive examination, we have seen how the architecture of a rapidly developing southern city inadvertently provided the perfect hunting ground for a monster who understood the layout of the alleys and the vulnerability of unlocked servant quarters better than the authorities ever did, creating a permanent chasm in the communal history of Texas that time alone can never fully heal. The mystery surrounding the true identity of the perpetrator remains one of the most agonizingly frustrating enigmas in the annals of American true crime, an impenetrable wall of silence that has withstood every attempt at historical deconstruction for over a century. Whether the shadowy phantom who terrorized Austin was Malay Cook, Nathan Elgin, or some entirely unknown entity slipping quietly through the southern night, the fact remains that earthly justice was never served, and no courtroom ever echoed with the solemn verdicts that could have brought a fragile semblance of closure to the grieving families. This complete absence of judicial resolution leaves a lingering void, a profound psychological dissonance that continues to captivate the collective imagination of criminologists, historians, and true crime chroniclers alike. We are creatures driven by an innate psychological need for narrative completion, desperately searching for the missing pieces of a puzzle that stubbornly refuses to be solved. Yet, in the case of the Austin Axe murders, we must accept the unsettling reality that some dark chapters of human history are destined to remain incomplete, their final pages torn away and swallowed by the mists of time. This unresolved ambiguity serves as a powerful reminder of the limitations of human investigation, particularly during an era predating modern forensics, standardized fingerprint identification, and psychological profiling. The catastrophic failures of the 1885 police department, marked by institutional prejudice, rushed and unjustified arrests, and the catastrophic contamination of vital crime scenes, stand as a permanent, cautionary benchmark for law enforcement agencies everywhere, illustrating the dangerous consequences of allowing systemic bias and desperation to override objective methodology and the fundamental duty to protect all citizens equally, regardless of their social or racial standing. The silence that fell over Austin following the sudden cessation of the violence offered no genuine answers, only a heavy, echoing void that testified to a city simply too exhausted and traumatized to continue searching for a ghost that had already vanished. The physical and cultural landscape of modern Austin continues to bear the indelible scars of this terrifying period, offering a tangible, daily link between our contemporary world and the panic-stricken city of the past. Those majestic 50-meter metal spires known as the Moonlight Towers, erected in the desperate, frantic aftermath of the slaughter to banish the dark hiding places where the predator once lurked, stand today as the world's last surviving monument to an era of absolute urban terror. They are far more than quirky historical anomalies or relics of late 19th century engineering. They are glowing sentinels of memory, casting their steady amber illumination across a bustling, highly developed metropolis, while keeping alive the haunting legacy of the dark winter nights that forged their creation. Every time a modern resident walks beneath their warm glow, they are unknowingly traversing a space born out of sheer survival instinct, a physical manifestation of a community's collective resolve to bring the hidden dangers of the night out into the open air. This unique architectural heritage ensures that the trauma of 1885 is never completely forgotten, serving as an eternal, silent guardian that watches over the city's vibrant present while anchoring it firmly to its troubled past. Alongside these physical monuments, the literary echoes of the era, immortalized by William Sidney Porter under his celebrated pen name O. Henry, have preserved the chilling atmosphere of the time through the precise coining of that unforgettable moniker, the servant girl annihilator. ensuring that the sheer scale of the terror would transcend local gossip and become an indelible part of the broader American historical consciousness, reminding every subsequent generation of the horrifying cost of unchecked malice in a rapidly changing world. As we bring this comprehensive, exhaustive exploration of the Austin Axe murders to its ultimate close, we must carry forward the heavy intellectual and emotional weight of the lessons embedded within this harrowing narrative. The story challenges us to look beyond the sensationalized thrills often associated with the true crime genre and confront the deeper, more uncomfortable realities of human cruelty, institutional failure, and societal vulnerability. It reminds us that evil does not always announce itself with a grand, theatrical gesture. Sometimes, it operates quietly in the margins, exploiting the systemic fault lines and prejudices of a divided community until it is too late to stop the carnage. The echoes of that distant winter will continue to whisper through the quiet hours of the night, reminding us of the delicate fragility of human safety and the eternal obligation we bear to protect the vulnerable among us. The Phantom of Austin has long since vanished into the southern mists, taking his darkest secrets down to an unmarked grave, but the lessons of his reign of terror remain etched into the historical record as a permanent warning from the past. Let us walk forward with a renewed commitment to empathy, vigilance, and truth, ensuring that the tragic stories of those who suffered in the dark are never silenced by the passage of time, and that their memories continue to shine brightly under the eternal watch of the Moonlight Towers. We must remember that behind every unsolved file and every forgotten statistic lies a human life of infinite value, a person whose voice was prematurely silenced by a monster, demanding of us an eternal pledge of remembrance and a relentless pursuit of justice and equality for all human beings across every generation. In the final analysis, the true measure of our engagement with such profound historical darkness lies not in our ability to solve the insoluble or uncover long-buried secrets, but in our capacity to honor the victims with unwavering dignity and respect. The passage of time may obscure the footprints left in the Texas mud, and the archives may forever remain stamped with the frustrating label of an unsolved mystery, yet the moral imperative of remembrance remains entirely unaltered. As listeners and chroniclers who dare to peer into the abyss of 1885, we accept the solemn responsibility of keeping these tragic narratives alive, transforming them from frightening folklore into poignant reminders of our shared human vulnerability. The legacy of the Austin Axe murders stands as an enduring monument to the resilience of a community that survived its darkest hour, rising from the ashes of panic and division to build a vibrant modern city. Yet, beneath the bright lights of the Moonlight Towers and the bustling energy of contemporary life, the echoes of those silent winter nights continue to resonate, calling upon us to remain eternally vigilant, deeply empathetic, and forever committed to a world where no life is ever marginalized, overlooked, or forgotten in the shadows. As we continue to navigate the intricate labyrinth of historical true crime and expand our reflection upon the dark winter months that forever altered the soul of Austin, Texas, we are inevitably drawn back to the profound psychological allure that unsolved mysteries hold over the collective human consciousness. There is something deeply unsettling yet perversely magnetic about a narrative that defies resolution, a story whose final chapters were deliberately torn away and swallowed by the impenetrable mists of time. When a crime wave of such unprecedented savagery strikes a community and then vanishes as abruptly and mysteriously as it began, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and unpunished atrocities, it creates an intellectual vacuum that subsequent generations feel an almost compulsive urge to fill. We are creatures intrinsically wired to seek patterns, demand explanations, and yearn for justice, finding it immensely difficult to accept that an individual capable of such calculated, unbridled malice could simply slip away into the shadows of the southern night and evade earthly accountability for the remainder of his days. This perpetual quest for answers transforms cold case files into modern folklore, ensuring that the ghosts of 1884 and 1885 continue to walk among us, whispering from the yellowed pages of old newspapers and police ledgers. Yet, in our relentless pursuit of the truth behind the servant girl annihilator, We must constantly guard against the temptation to romanticize the monster or reduce human tragedy to a mere intellectual puzzle. The true weight of the narrative does not lie in the elusive identity of the perpetrator, but in the profound, irreparable devastation he inflicted upon his victims and the enduring lessons we must draw from the systemic failures that allowed his reign of terror to unfold unchecked in a rapidly growing American city. The passage of time acts as a double-edged sword when applied to the historical analysis of 19th-century violence, simultaneously eroding the fragile physical evidence that might have solved the mystery while cementing the legendary status of the terror itself. More than a century and a half has elapsed since those bloody nights shook the foundations of Austin, washing away the footprints in the Texas mud, fading the bloodstains from the wooden floors of the servant quarters, and carrying the eyewitnesses, investigators, and suspects alike into the silent realm of the grave. What remains in the wake of this vast temporal chasm is a distilled essence of pure fear, preserved in the amber glow of the moonlight towers and the evocative prose of writers like O. Henry, who witnessed the panic firsthand and gave it a chilling linguistic shape. This historical distance allows us to examine the events with a clinical objectivity that was utterly impossible for the terrified residents of 1885, yet it also risks sanitizing the raw, bleeding reality of the trauma experienced by those who lived through it. When we speak of the servant girl annihilator today, we are often engaging with a historical abstraction, a symbol of urban dread that predates Jack the Ripper and foreshadows the modern era of serial predation. But beneath this academic fascination lies a grim, unalterable reality of human suffering that demands our utmost solemnity. The horror was not a fictional construct designed to thrill readers of a Gothic novel. It was a flesh-and-blood nightmare that tore through the lives of vulnerable women who were guilty of nothing more than trying to survive in a society that offered them neither protection nor equality. To truly understand the legacy of this dark chapter, we must peel back the layers of sensational folklore and confront the uncomfortable truths about the world that permitted such atrocities to occur without consequence. This brings us to the profound ethical responsibilities that weigh heavily upon anyone who chooses to chronicle real-world tragedies, reminding us that true crime storytelling is a delicate and sacred trust rather than a casual form of entertainment. In a contemporary media landscape saturated with sensationalized accounts of violence and a voyeuristic appetite for gore, it is dangerously easy to reduce real human beings to mere plot points in a chronological timeline of horror. We must actively resist this dehumanizing tendency by ensuring that our primary focus remains unwaveringly centered on the victims, honoring their memory with the dignity and respect they were so cruelly denied during their lifetimes. Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips were not background characters in a macabre drama scripted for our modern amusement. They were daughters, sisters, workers, and individuals with rich, complex inner lives, quiet aspirations, and families who loved them and carried the crushing weight of their loss for the rest of their days. Their violent deaths robbed them of their rightful tomtows and exposed the chilling vulnerability of marginalized populations living in the shadow of institutional indifference. When we tell their stories, we are performing an act of historical reclamation, rescuing their identities from the cold anonymity of unsolved case files and demanding that they be remembered not merely as victims of an unknown monster, but as human beings of infinite value whose voices were prematurely silenced. This ethical imperative requires us to approach the past with empathy, humility, and an unwavering commitment to truth, ensuring that the lessons embedded within their tragic fates are never obscured by the passage of time or lost in the pursuit of sensational folklore. The physical geography of contemporary Austin continues to bear witness to this haunting history, offering a tangible, daily link between our bustling modern metropolis and the terrified city of the past through the enduring presence of the Moonlight Towers. These majestic 50-meter metal spires, erected in the desperate, frantic aftermath of the slaughter to banish the dark hiding places where the predator once lurked, stand today as the world's last surviving monument to an era of absolute urban terror. They are far more than quirky historical anomalies or relics of late 19th century engineering. They are glowing sentinels of memory, casting their steady amber illumination across a vibrant city while keeping alive the haunting legacy of the dark winter nights that forged their creation. Every time a modern resident walks beneath their warm glow, they are unknowingly traversing a space born out of sheer survival instinct, a physical manifestation of a community's collective resolve to bring the hidden dangers of the night out into the open air. This unique architectural heritage ensures that the trauma of 1885 is never completely forgotten, serving as an eternal, silent guardian that watches over the city's vibrant present while anchoring it firmly to its troubled past. Alongside these physical monuments, the literary echoes of the era, immortalized by William Sidney Porter under his celebrated pen name O. Henry, have preserved the chilling atmosphere of the time through the precise coining of that unforgettable moniker, the servant girl annihilator, ensuring that the sheer scale of the terror would transcend local gossip and become an indelible part of the broader American historical consciousness, reminding every subsequent generation of the horrifying cost of unchecked malice in a rapidly changing world. As we draw the final curtains on this comprehensive and exhaustive exploration of the Austin Axe murders, we must carry forward the heavy intellectual and emotional weight of the lessons embedded within this harrowing narrative. The story challenges us to look beyond the sensationalized thrills often associated with the true crime genre and confront the deeper, more uncomfortable realities of human cruelty, institutional failure, and societal vulnerability. It reminds us that evil does not always announce itself with a grand, theatrical gesture. Sometimes, it operates quietly in the margins, exploiting the systemic fault lines and prejudices of a divided community until it is too late to stop the carnage. The echoes of that distant winter will continue to whisper through the quiet hours of the night, reminding us of the delicate fragility of human safety and the eternal obligation we bear to protect the vulnerable among us. The Phantom of Austin has long since vanished into the southern mists, taking his darkest secrets down to an unmarked grave, but the lessons of his reign of terror remain etched into the historical record as a permanent warning from the past. Let us walk forward with a renewed commitment to empathy, vigilance, and truth, ensuring that the tragic stories of those who suffered in the dark are never silenced by the passage of time, and that their memories continue to shine brightly under the eternal watch of the Moonlight Towers. We must remember that behind every unsolved file and every forgotten statistic lies a human life of infinite value, a person whose voice was prematurely silenced by a monster, demanding of us an eternal pledge of remembrance and a relentless pursuit of justice and equality for all human beings across every single generation. As we approach the ultimate threshold of this exhaustive and profound chronicle into the dark winter months of 1884 and 1885 in Austin, Texas, we find ourselves standing at the precipice of an enduring historical enigma that defies easy resolution. The narrative of the servant girl annihilator is not merely a recounting of unsolved homicides or a collection of gruesome anecdotes designed to satisfy a fleeting morbid curiosity. It is a sprawling, deeply unsettling meditation on the fragility of human civilization, the devastating consequences of institutional blindness, and the haunting reality of a predator who vanished into the southern mists without ever facing earthly retribution. When we trace the long, winding path from that initial, brutal assault on Molly Smith in the fading twilight of a dying year to the apocalyptic double massacre on Christmas Eve that shattered the protected sanctuary of the city's affluent elite, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of historical memory. History is so often constructed through the triumphant lens of progress, industrial expansion, and municipal success, deliberately casting its dark shadows over the vulnerabilities and sufferings of those who do not belong to the privileged classes. Yet, true historical reckoning requires us to shine a relentless light into those very shadows, giving voice, dignity, and remembrance to individuals who were systematically marginalized in life and nearly forgotten in death. The victims of this unidentified monster were women whose daily labor sustained the opulent lifestyles of Austin's wealthiest residents, yet whose safety and humanity were tragically undervalued by the institutions charged with their protection. By keeping their names alive, Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips we actively resist the cruel erasure of time, reclaiming their individual identities from the cold anonymity of an unsolved case file and honoring their memory with the deep respect, empathy, and solemn remembrance they so profoundly deserve. Throughout this extensive examination, we have seen how the architecture of a rapidly developing southern city inadvertently provided the perfect hunting ground for a ruthless killer who understood the layout of the alleys and the vulnerability of unlocked servant quarters better than the authorities ever did, creating a permanent chasm in the communal history of Texas that time alone can never fully heal. The mystery surrounding the true identity of the perpetrator remains one of the most agonizingly frustrating enigmas in the annals of American true crime, an impenetrable wall of silence that has withstood every attempt at historical deconstruction for over a century. Whether the shadowy phantom who terrorized Austin was Malay Cook, Nathan Elgin, or some entirely unknown entity slipping quietly through the southern night, the fact remains that earthly justice was never served, and no courtroom ever echoed with the solemn verdicts that could have brought a fragile semblance of closure to the grieving families. This complete absence of judicial resolution leaves a lingering void, a profound psychological dissonance that continues to captivate the collective imagination of criminologists, historians, and true crime chroniclers alike. We are creatures driven by an innate psychological need for narrative completion, desperately searching for the missing pieces of a puzzle that stubbornly refuses to be solved. Yet, in the case of the Austin Axe murders, we must accept the unsettling reality that some dark chapters of human history are destined to remain incomplete, their final pages torn away and swallowed by the mists of time. This unresolved ambiguity serves as a powerful reminder of the limitations of human investigation, particularly during an era predating modern forensics, standardized fingerprint identification, and psychological profiling. The catastrophic failures of the 1885 police department, marked by institutional prejudice, rushed and unjustified arrests, and the catastrophic contamination of vital crime scenes, stand as a permanent, cautionary benchmark for law enforcement agencies everywhere, illustrating the dangerous consequences of allowing systemic bias and desperation to override objective methodology and the fundamental duty to protect all citizens equally, regardless of their social or racial standing. The silence that fell over Austin following the sudden cessation of the violence offered no genuine answers, only a heavy, echoing void that testified to a city simply too exhausted and traumatized to continue searching for a ghost that had already vanished into the deep southern night without a trace. The physical and cultural landscape of modern Austin continues to bear the indelible scars of this terrifying period, offering a tangible, daily link between our contemporary world and the panic-stricken city of the past. Those majestic 50-meter metal spires known as the Moonlight Towers, erected in the desperate, frantic aftermath of the slaughter to banish the dark hiding places where the predator once lurked, stand today as the world's last surviving monument to an era of absolute urban terror. They are far more than quirky historical anomalies or relics of late 19th century engineering. They are glowing sentinels of memory, casting their steady amber illumination across a bustling, highly developed metropolis, while keeping alive the haunting legacy of the dark winter nights that forged their creation. Every time a modern resident walks beneath their warm glow, they are unknowingly traversing a space born out of sheer survival instinct, a physical manifestation of a community's collective resolve to bring the hidden dangers of the night out into the open air. This unique architectural heritage ensures that the trauma of 1885 is never completely forgotten, serving as an eternal, silent guardian that watches over the city's vibrant present while anchoring it firmly to its troubled past. Alongside these physical monuments, the literary echoes of the era, immortalized by William Sidney Porter under his celebrated pen name O. Henry, have preserved the chilling atmosphere of the time through the precise coining of that unforgettable moniker, the servant girl annihilator, ensuring that the sheer scale of the terror would transcend local gossip and become an indelible part of the broader American historical consciousness, reminding every subsequent generation of the horrifying cost of unchecked malice in a rapidly changing world. As we reflect upon the broader implications of this chilling narrative, We must confront the heavy ethical responsibilities inherent in chronicling real-world tragedies within the true crime genre. It is dangerously easy for modern audiences, distanced by more than a century of time, to consume these historical horrors as mere entertainment, treating real human suffering with a detached, voyeuristic curiosity. The blood-soaked details, the brutal mutilations, and the haunting atmosphere of a 19th-century southern city under siege can easily become reduced to sensationalized ghost stories told around a campfire. We must actively resist this impulse by anchoring our focus firmly where it belongs, on the humanity of the victims whose lives were so violently extinguished. Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips were not characters in a macabre fiction. They were daughters, sisters, workers, and human beings with vibrant inner lives, legitimate hopes for the future, and families who loved them. Their brutal deaths robbed them of their rightful tomorrows and left behind a legacy of unresolved grief that deserves to be remembered with solemn dignity and profound respect. The sociological dimensions of the Austin murders provide a critical lens through which we can examine the deeply entrenched prejudices of the post-Reconstruction American South, where the initial phase of slaughter targeting impoverished Black women met with a disheartening level of institutional indifference, while the later attacks on wealthy, white women sparked total panic. This stark contrast exposes an uncomfortable truth about the historical valuation of human life, revealing a hierarchy of grief that we must continually recognize and dismantle in our modern pursuit of true equality and justice for every member of society. The enduring legacy of the servant girl annihilator extends far beyond the borders of Texas, serving as an essential touchstone in the evolution of our understanding of serial predation and criminal pathology. Long before the term serial killer entered the common lexicon, and long before behavioral science could analyze signature crimes with scientific precision, this unidentified predator was operating with a chilling level of calculated anonymity that anticipated the darkest elements of 20th-century criminology. The striking parallels drawn by modern researchers between the Austin murders and the subsequent terror of Jack the Ripper in London highlight a fundamental divergence in how society responds to trauma, reminding us that historical memory is frequently shaped by geographic and racial biases. By refusing to let the Austin case remain obscured by these historical oversights, we contribute to a more complete and honest reckoning with the darker currents of our collective past. The lessons learned from the catastrophic investigative failures of 1885 underscore the vital importance of rigorous, unbiased police work, advanced forensic methodology, and an unwavering commitment to protecting society's most vulnerable populations from those who exploit systemic fault lines to perpetrate unspeakable violence in the dark. As we bring this extensive, exhaustive exploration of the Austin Axe murders to its ultimate close, we must carry forward the heavy intellectual and emotional weight of the lessons embedded within this harrowing narrative. The story challenges us to look beyond the sensationalized thrills often associated with the true crime genre and confront the deeper, more uncomfortable realities of human cruelty, institutional failure, and societal vulnerability. It reminds us that evil does not always announce itself with a grand, theatrical gesture. Sometimes, it operates quietly in the margins, exploiting the systemic fault lines and prejudices of a divided community until it is too late to stop the carnage. The echoes of that distant winter will continue to whisper through the quiet hours of the night, reminding us of the delicate fragility of human safety and the eternal obligation we bear to protect the vulnerable among us. The Phantom of Austin has long since vanished into the southern mists, taking his darkest secrets down to an unmarked grave, but the lessons of his reign of terror remain etched into the historical record as a permanent warning from the past. Let us walk forward with a renewed commitment to empathy, vigilance, and truth, ensuring that the tragic stories of those who suffered in the dark are never silenced by the passage of time, and that their memories continue to shine brightly under the eternal watch of the Moonlight Towers. We must remember that behind every unsolved file and every forgotten statistic lies a human life of infinite value, a person whose voice was prematurely silenced by a monster, demanding of us an eternal pledge of remembrance and a relentless pursuit of justice and equality for all human beings across every single generation. As we arrive at the final, profound frontier of this exhaustive, meticulous investigation into the dark winter months of 1884 and 1885 in Austin, Texas, we find ourselves standing at the edge of an enduring historical precipice that defies simple closure or easy explanation. The narrative of the servant girl annihilator is not merely a recounting of isolated homicides or a collection of macabre anecdotes designed to satisfy a fleeting morbid curiosity. It is a sprawling, deeply unsettling meditation on the fragility of human civilization, the devastating consequences of institutional blindness, and the haunting reality of a predator who vanished into the southern mists without ever facing earthly retribution or judicial accountability. When we trace the long, winding path from that initial, brutal assault on Molly Smith in the fading twilight of a dying year to the apocalyptic double massacre on Christmas Eve that shattered the protected sanctuary of the city's affluent elite, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable and enduring truth about the nature of historical memory and social hierarchy. History is so often constructed through the triumphant lens of progress, industrial expansion, and municipal success, deliberately casting its dark shadows over the vulnerabilities, sufferings, and systemic neglect of those who do not belong to the privileged classes. Yet, true historical reckoning requires us to shine a relentless, unblinking light into those very shadows, giving voice, dignity, and remembrance to individuals who were systematically marginalized in life and nearly forgotten in death. The victims of this unidentified monster were women whose daily labor sustained the opulent lifestyles of Austin's wealthiest residents, yet whose safety and basic human rights were tragically undervalued by the municipal and judicial institutions charged with their protection. By keeping their names alive, Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips, we actively resist the cruel erasure of time, reclaiming their individual identities from the cold anonymity of an unsolved case file and honoring their memory with the deep respect, empathy, and solemn remembrance they so profoundly deserve. Throughout this extensive examination, we have seen how the architecture of a rapidly developing southern city inadvertently provided the perfect hunting ground for a ruthless killer who understood the layout of the alleys, the darkness of the gardens, and the vulnerability of unlocked servant quarters better than the authorities ever did, creating a permanent chasm in the communal history of Texas that time alone can never fully heal. The mystery surrounding the true identity of the perpetrator remains one of the most agonizingly frustrating enigmas in the annals of American true crime, an impenetrable wall of silence that has withstood every attempt at historical deconstruction for over a century. Whether the shadowy phantom who terrorized Austin was Malay Cook, Nathan Elgin, or some entirely unknown entity slipping quietly through the southern night, the fact remains that earthly justice was never served, and no courtroom ever echoed with the solemn verdicts that could have brought a fragile semblance of closure to the grieving families and the traumatized community. This complete absence of judicial resolution leaves a lingering void, a profound psychological dissonance that continues to captivate the collective imagination of criminologists, historians, and true crime chroniclers alike. We are creatures driven by an innate psychological need for narrative completion, desperately searching for the missing pieces of a puzzle that stubbornly refuses to be solved. Yet, in the case of the Austin Axe murders, we must accept the unsettling reality that some dark chapters of human history are destined to remain incomplete, their final pages torn away and swallowed by the mists of time. This unresolved ambiguity serves as a powerful reminder of the limitations of human investigation, particularly during an era predating modern forensics, standardized fingerprint identification, and psychological profiling. The catastrophic failures of the 1885 police department, marked by institutional prejudice, rushed and unjustified arrests, and the catastrophic contamination of vital crime scenes, stand as a permanent, cautionary benchmark for law enforcement agencies everywhere, illustrating the dangerous consequences of allowing systemic bias and desperation to override objective methodology and the fundamental duty to protect all citizens equally, regardless of their social or racial standing. The silence that fell over Austin following the sudden cessation of the violence offered no genuine answers, only a heavy, echoing void that testified to a city simply too exhausted and traumatized to continue searching for a ghost that had already vanished into the deep southern night without a trace. The physical and cultural landscape of modern Austin continues to bear the indelible scars of this terrifying period, offering a tangible, daily link between our contemporary world and the panic-stricken city of the past. Those majestic 50-meter metal spires known as the Moonlight Towers, erected in the desperate, frantic aftermath of the slaughter to banish the dark hiding places where the predator once lurked, stand today as the world's last surviving monument to an era of absolute urban terror. They are far more than quirky historical anomalies or relics of late 19th century engineering. They are glowing sentinels of memory, casting their steady amber illumination across a bustling, highly developed metropolis, while keeping alive the haunting legacy of the dark winter nights that forged their creation. Every time a modern resident walks beneath their warm glow, they are unknowingly traversing a space born out of sheer survival instinct, a physical manifestation of a community's collective resolve to bring the hidden dangers of the night out into the open air. This unique architectural heritage ensures that the trauma of 1885 is never completely forgotten, serving as an eternal, silent guardian that watches over the city's vibrant present while anchoring it firmly to its troubled past. Alongside these physical monuments, the literary echoes of the era, immortalized by William Sidney Porter under his celebrated pen name O. Henry, have preserved the chilling atmosphere of the time through the precise coining of that unforgettable moniker, the servant girl annihilator, ensuring that the sheer scale of the terror would transcend local gossip and become an indelible part of the broader American historical consciousness, reminding every subsequent generation of the horrifying cost of unchecked malice in a rapidly changing world. As we reflect upon the broader implications of this chilling narrative, we must confront the heavy ethical responsibilities inherent in chronicling real-world tragedies within the true crime genre. It is dangerously easy for modern audiences, distanced by more than a century of time, to consume these historical horrors as mere entertainment, treating real human suffering with a detached, voyeuristic curiosity. The blood-soaked details, the brutal mutilations, and the haunting atmosphere of a 19th century southern city under siege can easily become reduced to sensationalized ghost stories told around a campfire. We must actively resist this impulse by anchoring our focus firmly where it belongs, on the humanity of the victims whose lives were so violently extinguished. Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips were not characters in a macabre fiction. They were daughters, sisters, workers, and human beings with vibrant inner lives, legitimate hopes for the future, and families who loved them. Their brutal deaths robbed them of their rightful tomorrows and left behind a legacy of unresolved grief that deserves to be remembered with solemn dignity and profound respect. The sociological dimensions of the Austin murders provide a critical lens through which we can examine the deeply entrenched prejudices of the post-Reconstruction American South, where the initial phase of slaughter targeting impoverished Black women met with a disheartening level of institutional indifference, while the later attacks on wealthy, white women sparked total panic. This stark contrast exposes an uncomfortable truth about the historical valuation of human life, revealing a hierarchy of grief that we must continually recognize and dismantle in our modern pursuit of true equality and justice for every member of society. The enduring legacy of the servant girl annihilator extends far beyond the borders of Texas, serving as an essential touchstone in the evolution of our understanding of serial predation and criminal pathology. Long before the term serial killer entered the common lexicon, and long before behavioral science could analyze signature crimes with scientific precision, this unidentified predator was operating with a chilling level of calculated anonymity that anticipated the darkest elements of 20th century criminology. The striking parallels drawn by modern researchers between the Austin murders and the subsequent terror of Jack the Ripper in London highlight a fundamental divergence in how society responds to trauma, reminding us that historical memory is frequently shaped by geographic and racial biases. By refusing to let the Austin case remain obscured by these historical oversights, we contribute to a more complete and honest reckoning with the darker currents of our collective past. The lessons learned from the catastrophic investigative failures of 1885 underscore the vital importance of rigorous, unbiased police work, advanced forensic methodology, and an unwavering commitment to protecting society's most vulnerable populations from those who exploit systemic fault lines to perpetrate unspeakable violence in the dark. As we bring this extensive, exhaustive exploration of the Austin Axe murders to its ultimate close, we must carry forward the heavy intellectual and emotional weight of the lessons embedded within this harrowing narrative. The story challenges us to look beyond the sensationalized thrills often associated with the true crime genre and confront the deeper, more uncomfortable realities of human cruelty, institutional failure, and societal vulnerability. It reminds us that evil does not always announce itself with a grand, theatrical gesture. Sometimes, it operates quietly in the margins, exploiting the systemic fault lines and prejudices of a divided community until it is too late to stop the carnage. The echoes of that distant winter will continue to whisper through the quiet hours of the night, reminding us of the delicate fragility of human safety and the eternal obligation we bear to protect the vulnerable among us. The Phantom of Austin has long since vanished into the southern mists, taking his darkest secrets down to an unmarked grave, but the lessons of his reign of terror remain etched into the historical record as a permanent warning from the past. Let us walk forward with a renewed commitment to empathy, vigilance, and truth, ensuring that the tragic stories of those who suffered in the dark are never silenced by the passage of time, and that their memories continue to shine brightly under the eternal watch of the Moonlight Towers. We must remember that behind every unsolved file and every forgotten statistic lies a human life of infinite value, a person whose voice was prematurely silenced by a monster, demanding of us an eternal pledge of remembrance and a relentless pursuit of justice and equality for all human beings across every single generation, ensuring that the darkness of 1885 serves not as a forgotten relic of history, but as an eternal beacon guiding us toward a more compassionate, vigilant, and just society where every life is cherished and protected against the shadows.